Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, the heavens opened as sheets of rain came tumbling down onto the asphalt road, so the grey tarmac gleamed with a wet sheen, while the bountiful raindrops trickled down Sheila's windscreen, wiped away by her efficient windscreen wipers. Bright headlights came speeding towards her from what all intensive purposes appeared to be a wide, substantial vehicle, a Walmart delivery lorry of all things. She could discern that much in the brief seconds she had to react. She slammed down her brakes as hard as she could on the single road, desperately trying to maneuver her steering wheel, swinging it to the left of the road to get out of this vehicle's way that was rapidly speeding towards her. But it was too late. Her neck swung forward. She heard the sound of crunching metal, shattering glass. In that desperate second, the windscreen wipers shut down. The headlights came off. Her car went colliding into the air, lifting up and over the guardrails, plundering down the steep embankment, rolling over and over and over again, until finally the rattling aluminium carcass, well, what was left of it after it had been bent, buckled and distorted beyond recognition, settled at the bottom of the ditch. Everything became infeliciously silent. The lorry driver clasped his hands on either side of his head as the rain continued to pelt down. For a moment he stared out into the dusky darkness in a state of suspended shock, a Nadaville daze-like trance, as he tried to digest what had just transpired, as if for a fleeting second he wanted to believe it was a trick of the light. But there was no doubt in his mind what had just transpired. A scene of carnage he had witnessed before his very eyes. He had not seen the vehicle, as his truck had been trudging along very happily. The car just appeared from nowhere, before he had time to press down his brakes. He had heard the dreadful impact as his huge lorry had collided with the car. He had seen the white car flying up in the air like a masterful acrobat. Then it had rolled down the embankment like a rattling tin of candies. In this moment he understood why there were hit-and-runs out on the roads at night. The way he felt right now, he'd love to run away, press down the accelerator, promptly drive away and disappear off the face of the earth. Or better still, retrace his footsteps in time so that this need never have happened. Ostensibly, even though his truck had come out of the collision with barely a scratch or a scrape to show for it, the lorry driver felt as if he'd been through a mince grinder himself. He became benumbed as he perceived the full gravity of what had transpired. Suddenly the rain stopped. Everything became still. There was no traffic on the roads, nothing at all. All was unnervingly, ominously quiet. Then he heard a knock on his window. He wound down his driver's window. A bemused man was looking in at him with a bewildered expression upon his face, possibly wondering why the lorry appeared to be barricading the road. "Is everything all right, mate?" Have you broken down or something? Do you need any help? No. There's been an accident. My truck hit a car. It went flying over the embankment. I didn't see it. You're in shock, mate. No wonder you're as white as a sheet. Have you called 911 yet? The lorry driver shook his head. I can't think straight. My mind, it's gone all fuzzy. I feel disorientated. Of course you do, mate. That's the shock talking, said the man, pulling out his cell phone and calling 911. Yes, ma'am. There's been an accident. I'm with the lorry driver. Right now, yes. He hit a car. It went rolling down the embankment here. He says it didn't look good. Thank you very much, ma'am, said the man, looking at the lorry driver with a reassuring glance. The emergency service is on their way. They're coming right now. Let's find the vehicle, shall we, that went over the ditch. The driver snapped out of his shocked state, dutifully following the man over the guardrail, down the steep embankment, hardly daring to breathe. He was terribly afraid of what he might see. For a second he drew in a deep breath. Then they saw the mangled car. Both the truck driver and the man looked at each other for a fleeting second. No words were spoken, as their thoughts were burdened by the horror of an instinctive revelation that both men shared. An ominous, pessimistic thought that they didn't want to articulate. It was not possible that anyone could survive this atrocious, macabre accident, of which the light of hope had been surely extinguished and dashed. The metal carcass was so pulverized it looked like it had been through a metal crusher. In a trice, as if by magic, the horrifying scene of carnage became frenzied with a plethora of blue, red and orange flashing lights. The police arrived on the scene, the fire brigade and the ambulance. The jaws of life were engaged. The mood was very dark and dingy. Silence descended over the ditch, while the firemen steadily worked, until finally the battered metal was open, rather like a can of sardines. "She's alive! Oh, my goodness! She's alive!" came the befuddled voice of a fireman. "She's broken an arm and a leg and has some kind of head injury." For a moment the lorry driver's heart lifted, as a renewed hope washed over his crushed heart. If this woman survived her injuries, he could just about live with himself, he thought. He watched the woman being placed on a gurney, put into the back of an ambulance, being rushed off to hospital with the sirens blazing. The traffic on the road was cordially redirected by police officers, as onlookers eager to know what was going on stopped their cars, sticking their inquisitive heads out of windows, trying to have a good old ogle. But they were to be bitterly disappointed, as they were waved away by the police officers. "Do you know what happened?" asked the policeman, looking at the bemused truck driver, who was lost in his thoughts and seemed to be 100 miles away. "Sorry, sir," repeated the policeman. "I know you've had a dreadful shock. These accident scenes are never easy to stomach," he said sympathetically. "Can you try and remember exactly what happened?" "All I know is it was pouring with rain. I saw the road ahead of me, but I never saw the woman's car. It appeared from nowhere. I pressed down the brakes, but it was far too late. My lorry went plunging into her car. I could hear the metal pulverizing. Her car lifted off the road, flew over the guardrail, plundered down the embankment, and rode to the very bottom. It happened so fast." "It's a miracle the woman's alive," said the policeman. "Life is very strange indeed. I've seen accidents without even a bump, and everyone is killed. And then this pulverized car, upon which you expect to see no survivors, and the woman is removed from the carnage alive. My word, the mind does boggle sometimes." Sheila, the girl that was ensnared in the car, was swiftly taken into accident and emergency. A team of doctors and nurses were waiting to receive her on the other end and began working on her with a prompt efficiency and speedy professionalism. She did recall strange voices speaking to her through the mayhem of buzzing activity. At one time she heard a male voice calling out her name. "Sheila? Sheila? I'm Dr. Redford. Can you hear me? You're in accident and emergency. You've had an accident. Can you try and wiggle your toe for me? Your left toe, please." Sheila tried to fight the confusion that engulfed her. She kept slipping into obscurity as her head injury swept her away from reality. But every so often she would slip back into the mist of the strange scene that was unfolding before her eyes, that seemed like a peculiar dream or a movie clip. She could make out blue, blurred figures hovering over her, talking in low, strange mumbles. She could hear a doctor's voice discussing her head injuries. "Could you call Dr. Carlyle, nurse, please? I'm not at all happy with the scan I have here. I need a second opinion now. This dark patch on the brain looks very disturbing. Could be bruising or a bad bleed. I'm not sure." "Yes, doctor," she heard the nurse say. She felt as if she was caught under a veil, trying to look through a misty curtain as she lay there, cloaked by a hazy fog, as if she was fighting her way through it, desperately trying to claw her way to the light. But she was always pushed backwards and plundered in the darkness. She would be overtaken by fatigue and exhaustion. Then she would float away until her consciousness was expunged from her. She knew nothing about where she was, for she slept through the operation and surgical procedures for many days. Sheila would sometimes get an evanescent glimpse into the real world, where the nurses attended to her every need dutifully. She was disorientated, heard murmurs of people talking in low voices, sensed activity around her. But then again she would drift away into a dark void of nothingness. One day she found her way through the fog and woke up. Where was she? She looked around apprehensively at a strange, unfamiliar environment that she was not well acquainted with. Where was she? This was not her bedroom at home. She was in a hospital bed. Her leg and arm were in casts. What had happened? Why was she here? She must have been in some kind of an accident, but she couldn't remember a single thing. A nurse glanced through the doorway, surprised to see the patient was wide awake, very confused, which was, of course, to be expected. "Hello, Sheila. I'm so glad to see you finally awake. I'm Nurse Philippa Adams. You were in a dreadful car accident. You're in hospital. You're in a stable condition now, I'm glad to tell you. But you have been unconscious for a few days now. How are you feeling?" Sheila looked at the nurse in bewilderment. I don't remember anything. Why am I here? What happened?" "All I know is you were involved in an accident. You collided with a delivery truck and went tumbling down an embankment. Apparently your car was pulverized. They say it's a miracle you're alive. I'll get the doctor to come and talk to you, shall I? He'll be glad to know you're finally awake." Sheila waited for the doctor to arrive. He smiled at her warmly. "Hello, Sheila. My name is Dr. Harvey. I'm pleased to see you're finally up. How are you feeling?" "I'm not sure. My head is pounding a little. I feel a bit fuzzy." "Well, that's not surprising. You've got a nasty bruising on your head, which explains your amnesia and confusion. We're delighted to have you here back with us. You were lucky to come out of that accident alive. But I'm afraid your kidneys took a beating in the accident. They were almost pulverized. They have not recovered, I'm afraid. They're functioning very poorly. We've run all the significant tests, and your kidney function is impaired. So I'm afraid in the long term you're going to need dialysis. We will put you on the kidney transplant list, but it looks like a long while before we can find you a suitable match. Although your family members might consider offering you a kidney, and then we can get the process activated a lot sooner. You can get them tested for their suitability, so that they can donate a kidney to you. You'll be pleased to know you can function very well in life with just one kidney." "Both my kidneys are damaged, Doc?" asked Sheila, looking perturbed. "But why? I don't understand." "That's a very good question, Sheila. When you were in accident and emergency, our greatest concern, naturally, was for your head injury. But it seems your kidneys took a beating. Of course, they've healed significantly after the accident, but their function remains abysmally poor and is unlikely to ever improve. Some things can't be explained. They are what they are. But if you ask me, you got off lightly. Things could have been a whole lot worse. By all accounts, you shouldn't have even got out of that car alive, so we have to be grateful for small mercies. Damaged kidneys It's a small price to pay." When Sheila's family gathered around her bed later that evening, Sheila felt numb after the doctor's harrowing revelations. She should have been dancing for joy to be alive, but knowing that she'd have to spend half her life hooked up to a kidney dialysis machine made her feel exceedingly depressed, disenchanted, and very demoralized. When her parents came to visit her that afternoon, she certainly looked like a withered flower in the meadow. "Sweetheart," said her mother, rushing over to her daughter, embracing her happily. "I'm so thrilled to see you, darling. For a while that head injury scared us half to death. But thankfully you just received some nasty bruising. But you seem to have made a full recovery. I'm so glad you're getting better. That's all I could hope and ask for." Sheila's father grabbed her hand, looking into her eyes adoringly. "My precious, precious angel, it's so good to see you, sweetheart. For a moment I thought we'd lost you. At first your brain scans didn't look good. We thought we might lose you. But thank God you're better. Thank God it was only bruising." "But I'm not better," said Sheila, a sorrowful tear dribbling down her cheek. "I'm not sure I'll ever be better again. I've got poor kidney function. I have to go on dialysis for the rest of my life. It's never going to be the same again for me. I had so many dreams. I wanted to become a travel writer, don't you remember? Now that's never going to happen for me. I'll be stuck here in Charleston for the rest of my life, stuck to a kidney dialysis machine of all things. And I'm only 21. My life's already come to an end before it's even started." "Your life has not come to an end, sweetheart. You're here, aren't you? You're alive and well. Things could have been so different, and you're of sound mind, are you not? It's a miracle that we cannot overlook. The doctor keeps reminding us that no one should have got out of that car in one piece, but you did, and that is something to be very grateful for. I grant you that it is a bummer that your kidney function is impaired. Of course it is. No one's disputing that for a single second. There's a very strong chance you could get a kidney transplant, which will give you back your freedom again. They've put you on the kidney transplant list. Even if you're hooked up to a dialysis machine for a while, the fact that you're with us is such a blessing, and it's a cause for celebration. Me and your father are going to get tested to see if we are suitable kidney matches for you. So don't look so downcast yet. Everything will be just fine. You wait and see." "I can't ask you to donate one of your kidneys to me if you're a match. That's asking way too much. I'm sure you'll end up getting very sick for a long time before you finally recover. I couldn't put you through all that." "Sheila, listen to me. Your mother and I don't care about any of that. You're our special little girl. If one of us is a match, we will definitely be donating a kidney to you. So we don't want you protesting against it. You're our daughter, for goodness sake." Sheila was soon to learn that neither of her parents were a suitable match. But then out of the blue, like a twinkling gift on the horizon, a mystery donor came forward, who was a perfect match, insisting that Sheila was to be the recipient of the spare kidney, which even the doctors said was miraculous. "You're a very lucky lady," Sheila the doctor had told her. "We couldn't have hoped for a more suitable match. It was like this kidney was made especially for you. The donor is in excellent health. The kidneys are functioning superbly." "But who donated their kidney to me?" "I'm not at liberty to divulge personal details like that. But that is not significant. We can be ever thankful that we have a kidney for you, which means you will be able to resume a normal life. Nothing to be sneezed at. You'll be needing to take immunosuppressants, or shall we say anti-rejection drugs, so that your body does not reject your kidney. You'll have to take these drugs for as long as you have the transplant. We will have to perform ongoing tests to ensure that your kidney has taken well, that your body has accepted it. Then you will have physiotherapy for a while, as after the operation, your belly and side will be sore for about 2 weeks. There might be some numbness around the scar, but from 3 to 6 weeks afterwards, your energy should return. How long will this kidney last me if my body does accept it, Doc?
It should last you about 10 to 13 years, as you have a live donor. Then, of course, you will need another donation.
It sounds too dreadful, Doctor, said Sheila, sighing. How long is the operation?
It'll be about 3 hours, not too long.
Sheila was to receive a kidney transplant against all odds. She was in hospital for 6 weeks, recovering from her transplant. It would seem her new kidney was functioning superbly. She was to ponder who the mystery donor who had come forward to give her a match was. But she knew whoever they were, they had given her a second chance at life. They had to be a saint. Sheila had not been short of visitors during her stay in hospital. It would seem everyone had made a fuss over her. They were delighted to see that she was alive, most especially her closest girlfriends. "I saw the pictures of your car crash," her friend Isabella had exclaimed. "I'm so gobsmacked you made it out of that thing alive. It's incredulous. I gather the fire brigade had to cut you out of your own car, like a sardine from a tin. Do you remember anything from the accident at all?" "Remember seeing the lorry coming. I had to get out of the way as quickly as I could, but it was too late. My car flipped and rolled down the embankment, and that's everything that I remember, as my memory blacks out after that. Did you think you were going to die?" "I think it crossed my mind fleetingly, but things happened too quickly, although as it was happening it felt like forever, as if everything was in slow motion. It was really bizarre, actually. I suppose I kind of realised in that moment that what will be, because it was out of my control now. Did you pray?" "No, of course I didn't. I didn't have time for any of that." One of her first visitors at the hospital after her accident and before her kidney transplant was the lorry driver, a congenial, self-effacing, humble young man called Freddie Owens, who was only 25 years old. He was a very good-looking, 6-foot-tall man with dark curly hair, greenish-blue eyes that rather reminded Sheila of the ocean. When Sheila saw him, she gasped. She felt certain she was being visited by a film star, but he was too unassuming, unpretentious and reserved to be a film star. He was possibly blindly oblivious to how attractive he actually was. Sheila approved of men like that, who had no vain leanings or inflated egos. He had arrived at the hospital with the biggest bouquet of flowers, a massive box of chocolates, and a huge balloon which said, "Best wishes, get better soon." "Hello, Sheila," he said, taking a seat opposite her bed. "I hope it's not presumptuous of me to visit you like this, but I've been awfully worried about you. Your parents kindly gave me permission to come and visit you. I haven't been able to stop thinking about you." "Sorry," said Sheila, looking at the man blankly. "I don't mean to be rude, but I don't know you, do I?" "No, you don't. My name is Freddie. I was the man driving the lorry on the day of the dreadful accident. I drove into your car. I'm dreadfully, dreadfully sorry for what happened. Really, I am. I wish I could go back in time and reverse everything, but obviously I can't. I didn't see your car on the road. Suddenly there you were. I slammed on the brakes as hard as I could, but it was all too late. I'm not sure if the rain obscured my vision, but I didn't see you. To this day, I don't understand why I never saw you. My vision is most usually excellent. I had to come and see you to apologize for what happened." Sheila looked at Freddie in surprise. "You're a really good man. I mean, making this effort to come and see me, and you don't even know me from Adam. I'm very impressed. Thank you so much for coming. I'm so grateful." "Of course I'd come. You don't need to thank me for that. I needed to see you. I drive a lorry for a living. I pride myself on being a vigilant driver. I've seen heinous accidents out on those roads, let me tell you. None of them pretty. When I saw your car at the bottom of that embankment in that ditch, I was almost certain you had to be dead. I remember how nonplussed the fireman was to discover you were alive. He couldn't believe it. Everyone wanted to celebrate. All the emergency workers did. Of course, we didn't know whether you would pull through or not, as your head seemed to have taken a rather nasty beating. And as you probably well know, head injuries have a notorious reputation for often being fatal.
I'm so relieved you're alive. I can't tell you how much of a load it is off my mind."
"Me too," said Sheila. "Everyone tells me I'm a walking miracle."
"In that case, why do you look so downcast?"
"You know, it's funny," said Sheila, looking at Freddie. "I ended up with a broken leg and an arm in that crash. A head injury the doctors were rarely worried about, but all the time it was just a simple bruising. In the end, it was my kidneys that gave me problems. Somehow they were impacted badly by the collision. Although they recovered, my kidney function is very poor, so they are talking about dialysis and kidney transplants in the not-too-distant future, I'm afraid." Freddie ran his hand through his black locks of hair. His brow furrowed.
"No wonder you look down. Your kidneys," he said. "That's a big deal. So you didn't emerge from this accident unscathed after all, as I had been led to believe. Now that is a dreadful shame. Kidney dialysis, no, that's awful."
"Well, I'm going to have to be put on dialysis until they find a match for me. I'll be put on the kidney donor list, and that could be a long wait."
"I'm very sorry to hear that," said Fred. "I wish there was something I could do. I had a relative on kidney dialysis, you know. It did interfere with his life, until he finally got his kidney. Of course, I tried to offer him one of my kidneys, but I wasn't a match for him."
"How is he today?" Sheila asked.
"Well, he had a successful transplant, I'm glad to say. These days he's fighting fit. To date, he's had 2 transplants, and he's very well, I'm glad to report."
Sheila looked heartily relieved. "So tell me about yourself, Freddie. How long have you been driving a truck?"
"Well, since I was young. I'm 25, but I've been driving professionally for the last 3 years. In truth, it feels like a lifetime. My dad drove a truck for a living, so I guess you could say it's in the blood, in the genes, so to speak. Let's just say I'm a bit of a loner. I enjoy my own company. I was always like that as a boy. Never made many friends. I was very introverted. I loved being close to nature. When I drive my truck, I thoroughly enjoy driving through that exquisite countryside. I appreciate all the beguiling views. Frankly, there is nothing to beat it. When I'm on leave, I tend to go camping or for walks in the countryside. I just adore the natural world."
"Are you married?" Sheila asked.
"I was at 21. Far too young, I have to say. But the wife got fed up with me asking me for a divorce after only a month or 2 on the road. She was complaining bitterly that I was never at home. It's an old story with many truck drivers, I'm afraid. She never got to see me, so when she went out at night with all her girlfriends, she felt very much alone without her other half present. She couldn't hack it. I'm afraid it's like that for a lot of truckers' wives. So many of them get divorced. It's not a new story by any strength of the imagination."
"I can imagine. I'm sorry. You probably need the type of girl who's more independent, doesn't mind her own company, so that when you get together again, she's actually pleased to see you, that she doesn't have any personal hang-ups."
"Well, as far as women are concerned, I think 1 divorce on my belt is more than enough. I don't want to go down that grueling path again, even though I'm still very young."
Sheila's personal account. "I was glad to finally be leaving the hospital with a brand new kidney. The doctors and nurses had been kind to me. I had been visited by all my friends, but I was looking so forward to returning to my home in Charleston, where I lived in a fabulous green leafy neighbourhood with my family. On my return home, there was a bright, colourful welcome home sign on the front door of my parents' contemporary home, along with a plethora of pink, white and gold balloons bobbing up on the ceiling of the entrance hall. Then waiting for me on the inside were all my friends bundled up together, with glasses of champagne that was fizzing in their hands, welcoming me back with bright smiles on their faces. 'Welcome home, Sheila! Welcome home!' they cried. It was an enjoyable surprise party, which included a sumptuous, delicious spread, and lots of fizzing champagne, none of which I could enjoy, as I was on a strict diet for my kidney. In truth, as lovely as it was to receive such a rapturous, warm welcome from my well-meaning friends, I was heartily relieved when they'd gone home, and the fuss had died down. I just wanted to settle down to normal life as quickly as possible. It would seem that with the passing of time, the doctors were well pleased with my progress. The tests revealed that my new kidney was thriving well. My health was blossoming. I was also taking a plethora of medications to support my kidney health, and of course anti-rejection drugs to protect my kidney. I felt as fit as a fiddle, but something in me had changed dramatically. Something I couldn't put a finger on. It was a new unfamiliar side of me that was stirring up or awakening, something that I was not acquainted with. Maybe I was just growing up faster, I thought, as after such a calamitous accident it is bound to put things into perspective, and of course to make you see your life through new eyes. Before my accident I'd always been the life and soul of the party, the centre of attention, the buzzing socialite that adored the hub and bub of city life, the intoxicating allure and sparkling disco lights of the partying scene. For me, getting slightly inebriated had been a big part of my young life, including dancing the night away to some of my favourite track music. Getting drunk was always such a pleasurable experience, without, of course, the dreadful hangovers that invariably followed the very next day, that I'd sooner rather forget. I loved dressing to the nines in fashionable, tight-fitting dresses, with sexy high heels. So visiting bars, fancy restaurants and the theatre was as natural to me as drinking water. My best pastime was shopping to buy clothes. I loved everything fashionable and wanted to keep up with all the current trends. I valued the fast pace of city life, while life in the countryside had never held any appeal for me. Of course, I enjoyed holidays, but in the past I preferred to visit glamorous places where no expense had been spared. Now something in me had changed significantly. When my friends began phoning me, asking me to go out partying with them, I began to make excuses. Of course, I wasn't permitted to drink alcohol, but that wasn't the reason I declined their invites at all. I would have been happy not to drink. They naturally assumed I was turning them down because I was still rehabilitating from my kidney transplant, but nothing could have been further from the truth. I just did not want to go partying at all, nor did I fancy the idea of socialising. For me it was about as inspiring as champagne that has lost its sparkle. Even my parents commented on how I was spending all my time walking out in the green leafy park, wallowing in my own company. "Darling," my mother had said, "I'm desperately, desperately worried about you, dear. Ever since you've come out of hospital, you seem to have become a loner. You're very detached these days. You never seem to want to go out with your friends anymore. You're isolating yourself from everyone. I'm worried that you're slipping into a depression. The doctor warned us that a couple of months after a transplant, many patients get depressed. Now, it's nothing to be ashamed or embarrassed about, Sheila, but it is something we need to address with the doctor. I'm sure it's natural to feel downcast after any major surgical procedure." "But I'm not depressed," I insisted. "I just like being on my own. I like the quiet walks in the park, being out in nature. I find it invigorating. I find it soothing." "But that, my sweetheart, is not the Sheila I used to know." "Well, maybe I've changed," I suggested, "but I promise you I'm not depressed. I would tell you if I was. In fact, when I'm out walking in the park, I don't ever remember feeling happier. I love walking on the grass, being surrounded by all the trees. It's such a pleasurable sanctuary." "Are you really sure you're not depressed?" my mother kept asking me. "Absolutely certain," I said. I couldn't be happier. One night I was lying in my bed. I drifted off to sleep. I could see myself walking in this beautiful viridescent green forest. It was so transfixing, it took my breath away. I remember standing there in my dream, feeling certain I had died and gone to heaven. I could feel the joy in my heart, the spring in my step, as I ambled through this woodland sanctuary. The canopy above my head was shaded by tall woodland trees, with their leafy boughs extended high up in the sky. But between the open branches, slivers of twinkling sunlight danced onto the earthen floor, dappling the forest in an ethereal light. The air was filled with the pretty warbles and tweets of birds, while a gentle breeze blew through the forest, causing the trees to sway gently. I could smell a woody pine-like scent, along with the scent of wild flowers, that was pleasing to behold.
All of a sudden my dream became much more menacing, as the birdsong began to fade away until it was gone.
The forest seemed to become darker. The wind began to whistle through the trees. The trees were now bodeful and inauspicious, as if they had somehow morphed into angry giants that were telling me to go away, go away. Soon the wind stopped. Everything became portentously quiet. In my dream, I became hauntingly aware that I was certainly not alone. I felt conspicuous, vulnerable, terribly afraid. I was wearing a white nightdress. Then I could see these blazing red eyes, menacious eyes, leering at me from between the branches, burning into my soul like searing hot irons. I was in the presence of a predator. I couldn't see him, but I could feel him and sense him, for his occupation of the space in this forest could easily be discerned. For whatever he was huge. I could taste danger and trepidation on my tongue, nauseous bile at the back of my throat, smell on the wind, malodorous, putrid odour of death and decay. Then I saw a hulking, great big blob of black, a silhouette of mammoth proportions covered in hair, between the spaces of green leaves, as he moved stealthily through the tall vegetation. The branches of the leaves jiggled, rocked, swayed, and even groaned. Leaf litter was crunched beneath heavy, ponderous feet, while the earthen floor seemed to jolt, almost as if there was a mini earthquake. I could hear branches breaking and snapping, a tree falling to the ground with a mighty thud. Then I saw him, a huge heaving silhouette of black, thundering towards me, a pair of bright red menacing eyes. A Bigfoot! I couldn't run. I froze to the spot. My mind screamed, "Run, or you're dead!" I began to run, my heart pounding in my ears, my head clammy with sweat, my mind a terrifying whirl. And as I ran, my life flashed before me. I knew in a single moment, it would all be over. I would be dead. The next thing I knew was my mother was shaking me. Sweetheart, are you all right? You've been screaming the house down. I think you've been having a nightmare." I sat up, heartily relieved to see the familiarity of my bedroom, the curtains on my window pane swaying against the breeze from the open window, my body covered by the comfort of my warm, cosy duvet. "Oh my God, Sheila, you're shaking like a leaf," said my mother. "You look like you're sweating. Your nightdress is completely soaked. What on earth happened, sweetheart?" "Mum, I was having the most terrible nightmare. There was a Bigfoot. He was so big. He was so terrifying. He was trying to kill me." My mother looked at me with a puzzled expression on her face. "A Bigfoot? You know those things aren't real, surely. What a peculiar dream to have." "It felt so real, Mum. I felt like I was in the forest. I felt like it was really, really happening to me. I felt like I was going to die." Over the next month, my nightmares got progressively worse, but during the day I was absolutely fine. My parents had noticed a shift in my personality. I had changed in more ways than they could ever have imagined. It was over dinner that my mother broached the subject with me. "Sweetheart, I know you're going to think this is very strange and peculiar, but I feel I need to discuss this contentious issue with you. I believe there's a correlation between your kidney transplant and your current nightmares, and of course your personality. You see, I was speaking to your Aunt Pixie. She knows a thing or two. She sent me some articles written in the medical journal about organ transplantation and personality changes going hand in hand with each other, as well as cellular memory." "What are you talking about, Mum?" I said, popping a piece of sausage in my mouth. "Stop speaking in riddles, will you? You're confusing me. What on earth are you trying to say?" "Well, for a start," said my mother, pointing at the sausage I was eating, "if you do remember, before your accident, you couldn't abide eating meat. You were a staunch vegetarian. But since your kidney transplant, you've been craving meat all of a sudden. Do you remember when I made you a vegetable pie when you came back? In the past, you would have been thrilled, but this time you seemed disappointed, as you had been hankering for a steak. At first I thought it was your body's way of craving iron, but now I have a different opinion and theory altogether. So you think I'm craving meat because of my new kidney? Well, think about it, dear. Everything about you has changed since your kidney transplant. At first I thought you were spiralling down the slippery slope of depression when you chose to disregard your friends and you kept taking long walks in the park. But you assured me you were very happy. Then there's the business of these nightmares you keep getting. I believe they're not nightmares at all, but something altogether different. What are you talking about, Mum? Of course they're nightmares. You know, every time I have that dreadful lucid dream, or whatever you choose to call it, I wake up in a sweat. I mean, I'm shaking. I'm completely terrified. It feels so hauntingly real, as if it's really happening to me. Of course it feels real, darling. I'm not disputing that for a moment. In fact, that's my point. I think you're actually remembering a real event that never happened to you, but happened to the owner of your kidney. I think your kidney donor had a terrifying experience that is imprinted on his cell's memory, leaving behind an indelible imprint. If you think about it, trauma can leave its mark on a place. That's why you get haunted houses. Why not the cells of your own body? If you ask me, it's a very likely explanation for your current nightmare. Listen to this report I found. I'm going to read it to you now. A young woman who was described by her family as a social climber, a rather obnoxious character, came through a kidney transplant 5 months ago. Even after the operation, it was discovered the lady had undergone significant character changes. She became meek and gentle, a much more amenable character. When she returned home, she was mortified to discover she had acquired so many material possessions, which she immediately gave away to family and friends. She started attending church regularly, when the family had no religious propensities or affiliations. 2 years later, the same woman converted to Catholicism. A reporter for the Sunday Mirror in Britain decided to investigate the origins of this curious case and the woman's kidney transplant. The donator of the kidney was traced back to a gentle Catholic nun. Many scientists are starting to believe that there is something known as cellular memory, which is believed to affect the recipient of a brand new organ in organ transplantation, where the previous owner of the organ's cell imprint can literally influence them in more ways than they can imagine. An extraordinary case in Brazil was soon to discover that a young girl, after her kidney transplantation, her whole blood type changed to match that of the new kidney, so that she was removed off kidney anti-rejection drugs, as her own body saw her kidney as belonging to her. Unfortunately, the family in question was very protective over their daughter, simply refusing any interviews, so this case is not well documented. All these cases appear to be mind-boggling, but the research is far too expensive and time-consuming to date. But there does seem to be a likely link between cellular memory and organ transplantation. It would seem some people report no significant changes in their likes and dislikes, but in others, the transformations they report are remarkable in every regard. Wow! That's incredible, Mum. You think my nightmare is an event that possibly happened to my live donor. You think it might be a cellular memory, that I'm remembering an event that actually happened to the donor of my kidney. I'm afraid so, darling. I really do. Of course, there's no way of knowing this unless you were to speak to your donor yourself and tell him about your nightmare and compare notes. Only then will you be able to establish with him whether it actually happened or not. But based on how distressed you get by your nightmare, there's no way that it's normal. It's like you're almost suffering from a post-traumatic stress disorder, as if the event really happened to you. Well, that's what it feels like, Mum. In the past I've had nightmares, but never like this. This nightmare is different. It really is. The trouble is, seeking out my donor is never going to happen. The hospital are very unlikely to reveal the identity of the mystery donor to me. For a moment I stared at my mother. Why do you keep referring to my donor as a he? For all you know, my kidney could have come from a female. Unless, you know, don't you, Mum? You know the random person who donated their kidney to me. Who is it, Mum? My mother flushed. I promised I wouldn't tell, but in the circumstances with your nightmares, and of course your personality changes, I think that you need to speak to your donor. I think it's the only way you might be able to put an end to the nightmare, to gain some perspective, so to speak. I don't understand, Mum.
Why, you never told me. Who is my donor? If you knew who it was all along, why didn't you tell me? You knew I wanted to know who the donor was. Because, darling, he didn't want you to know. He contacted me and told me he wanted to donate his kidney to you. I really doubted he would be a match, but against all the odds, it seems he was. He was perfect. In fact, you couldn't have found a better match. I think we need him to pop around and see you. I'm sure if I talk to him, he'll agree to reveal his identity and the circumstances. Do I know him? I think you might have met him once before. The following week we had an unexpected guest for dinner, whom my mother had cordially invited around, but I could not help but notice that there were only 2 places laid out for dinner, one for me and one for the mystery guest. This was the elusive person that had so graciously donated a kidney to me. Who does that? As far as I was concerned, he was a hero or a saint. Close your eyes, darling, my mother said to me. Your kidney donor is here. I think you've got a lot to talk about, the 2 of you. I gasped as the truck driver, Freddie, who'd crashed into my car, walked through the door, grinning sheepishly. Yes, I confess, it was me. I hold my hands up. I'm guilty as charged, he teased. You're my donor. I'd never have guessed. It was awfully selfless of you to donate your kidney to me. Well, I was the one that crashed into your car, wasn't I? So if I could give you one of my kidneys, it was a done deal as far as I was concerned. No one was more surprised than I was to discover I was a perfect match. I didn't expect that to be the case. In truth, I was over the moon, as it was one way I could make a small difference in your life. That's incredible. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to thank you for giving me a kidney. You've given me my life back. I'm so grateful. Well, it's the least I can do, as I was telling you. But your mother seems to think that my kidney has been giving you character changes and a nightmare, which is why I decided to come clean. I'd like to help in any way if I can. I flushed with embarrassment. I'm sure my mother's talking nonsense. I've been having this repetitive nightmare. My mother's absolutely convinced that this nightmare of mine is actually something that might have happened to you. She thinks it's a memory that has left an imprint on your cells, so now I'm remembering something that happened to you, and not to me. But it feels like it happened to me, if you know what I mean. That's a curious concept. I tell you what, why don't you tell me your nightmare? I'll let you know if there's any credence to your mother's outlandish notion. As I proceeded to tell Freddie my story, the colour drained from his face. It was then that I knew my dream was in fact a real event, something so traumatic that the memory had been imprinted on Freddie's own cells. I received his kidney. I was able to relive a memory that was not my own, and appreciate the very real fear that Freddie experienced, that was so traumatic that it is imprinted on every cell of his body, like a tape recording, and transferred to me. Freddie's story. As Sheila began to tell me her lucid nightmare, I soon realised she was telling me my own story, an event that actually happened in my own life. There was no way she could have possibly known about my secret. This was something I had no intention of ever sharing with anyone. But it seems when I donated my kidney to Sheila, I also donated not only my preferred tastes in food, my personality traits, which includes being a loner and a quintessential lover of nature, but I'd also donated a profound experience that impacted my life dramatically. This is my story. I was 18 years old at the time. I decided to house sit for an old lady called Mrs. Van Dyke, who had 2 big cats that needed to be looked after. I say big because they were roly-polies, so incredibly fat that their stomachs rubbed against the floor as they walked or waddled. But to date I've never met 2 more affectionate cats. They were both ginger cats called Lazatar and Oranger, that didn't know how to stop purring. They would lie on my bed at night, offering far more warmth than an electric blanket ever could. I don't know why they were so fat, as their diet was quite calorie restricted, but I had a sneaky suspicion that they were quite good hunters, as I discovered 6 rat's tails under the bed when I was cleaning up, and 8 decapitated rat heads, so I suspect the rest of those rats were devoured by the 2 hungry cats. I had seen an advert for this job stuck on one of the recruitment walls at the local post office. It was a perfect job opportunity for me that I snatched up very eagerly, as Mrs. Van Dyke lived in a cabin in the woods that looked exactly like something from a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale. She was an amenable woman, but insisted I met her first for an interview before she gave me the job.
"You can't be too careful," she said to me. "I need to make absolutely sure that you're the right house sitter for my cats. I'm afraid Lazatar and Oranger are very particular about who it is that takes care of them while I'm away. So before I can give you the job, I need to see how they actually feel about you." She called her cats over, and I kid you not, like two very obedient, well-trained dogs, they responded to her calls. When I first laid eyes on the two rotund cats, I was visibly shocked by their excessive girths. They were so huge, but wobbled up to me amiably, brushing against my legs, purring profusely, as if expressing their approval to Mrs. Van Dyke, who seemed genuinely pleased by their response to me. "You will do very nicely. I've interviewed 12 people for the job. You're the only one my cats have liked." They hissed at all the others. "I go away twice a year to visit my sister who lives in England, so I almost always need someone to man the fort for me while I'm abroad. Why is it, young man, that you want this job? I must ask you this, as my cabin is very remote. What is the interest in this place for a young man like yourself? Indeed, most of the people that applied for this job were early retirement age, but you're still a youngster. Should you not be parting it up with your friends, having a wild time in Charleston?" "That's not really my thing, ma'am. I'm not a social bunny. I enjoy my own company, you see," I told her sincerely. "I'm a bit of a loner, never really been a people's person. I've always preferred animals. I love nature. Growing up, half the time I would sleep out in a tent in the backyard. My father, who's a lorry driver, encouraged my free spirit, as he was always like me when he was my age." "In truth, you sound like a man after my own heart, which I'm jolly glad about. Why do you think I live out here in the sticks? I just love my own privacy. Like a lone wolf or a hermit, you could say. I've always been like that. I also love the natural world, but I feel I need to warn you that out in the woods at night there can be things that you would do well to avoid or circumvent if you like. I've lived in this cabin for over 25 years, and I've seen and heard ambiguous cryptid things that are unfathomable and inscrutable." "Like what?" I asked curiously. "Like light orbs dancing through the woods. Some of them are blue, others yellows and whites. I've even seen shadow beings slipping in and out of the trees. I've heard disembodied screams and strange howls." She looked apprehensive for a moment. "I hope I'm not putting you off, dear, because I really do need someone to look after my cats. But the last person who stayed at my cabin abandoned them. Naturally, I was completely devastated. I returned home to find that they'd been left to their own devices. But bless their cotton socks, they managed to take care of themselves. You know cats can be resourceful, should the need arise. And these two, they're fine hunters. Even so, I can't abide someone abandoning my precious babies like that. I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you're going to stay here, you're going to need nerves of steel. If the dark frightens you, this is not a place you would find congenial for you. It can be spooky in the woods at night, and especially when there are no street lights. Being in the middle of nowhere, a place like this can be more than a little intimidating, shall we say. Mrs. Van Dyke, I hope this is not out of term, but why did the young man desert his post? Was he frightened off by the light orbs, by any chance?" "No, it wasn't that. He claimed that an abominable snowman had chased him out of the woods in the middle of the night. In fact, he described it as a humongous demon with blazing red eyes that he was certain wanted him dead. I had warned him not to go into the woods at night. Would he listen? No, of course not. That's just too much to ask. You tell someone not to do something, and then they're seized with an inclination and a desperate desire to do the very thing that you tell them that they should not do. Why do people never listen? If he had listened to me, this would never have happened in the first place." I wasn't sure what to make about the spurious abominable snowman story, but I was excited about staying on my own in the cabin. I was an avid reader. I had some detective mysteries I wanted to get into. I wasn't concerned about going into the forest at night, because that was never going to happen. I didn't like the idea of exploring a woodland space in the dark. However, during the day it would be a fabulous adventure. I loved hiking and exploring, so I was looking exceedingly forward to my 2-week break away from the hustle and bustle of the very predictable tedium of city life back in Charleston. On the day I was moving into the cabin for 2 weeks, I went shopping in Charleston to stock up for supplies. I put them in the back of my father's old SUV. I drove to the cabin, very nearly losing my way in the process,
as it was so off the beaten track. I remember I became disorientated. I had to hail down some young man who was cycling on a bicycle. "Excuse me, do you know the way to the Whistling Woods cabin? I've been there before, but I've completely lost my way." The young man got off his bicycle. He stood outside my SUV window, looking in at me. I think he was about the same age as I was, with curly blonde hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to become quite startled when I mentioned the Whistling Woods cabin. You're going to stay at Mrs. Van Dyke's cabin, are you?" "That's right." "You're braver than most. I'll give you that." "What do you mean, braver than most? What are you talking about?" "You don't know what happened in the woods over 30 years ago?" "No, what happened?" The young man lowered his voice to almost a whisper, looking around himself furtively, as if he was afraid that the trees were listening in on our private conversation. "I don't like to speak about such things, but it was just too terrible. At the time it was all very hushed up, brushed under the carpet, so to speak. My guess it's bad for tourism when people hear deplorable things like this. I gather it was 2 German tourists. They were taking a hiking trail in the woods. The Whistling Woods were open to the public back then, although not many people know about the trail anymore. It's not listed on the maps. Very convenient, if you ask me. How does a well-known hiking trail disappear off a map without good reason, I ask you?" "Well, what happened to the 2 men?" I asked. "They disappeared after they went for a casual stroll in the Whispering Woods at night. A search party went to look for them. Their deceased bodies were found in an atrocious state. Their eyes had been removed from their sockets. Their heads had been yanked off their bodies and placed onto wooden stocks in the ground, almost like an insidious warning to tell people to stay the hell out of those woods. Even their arms and legs were flung haphazardly over trees. I gather it was a gory, gut-churning, gruesome scene. The deceased bodies were returned to Germany. The authorities claimed the 2 men had been killed by bears." "Please, bears? A bear doesn't kill like that. Bears do tend to go for the head, but they don't go around decorating the wood with macabre, tormenting displays like that. Everyone knew it was a huge cover-up around here. Something else killed them. But what? That is the question. Of course, the sheriff could not fathom how those people died, so the investigation just drew to a swift halt. No one said a word about what happened. It was odd, to say the least. Over the years, strange things have been seen in that forest. A headless man, shadow beings, strange orbs, monsters, you name it. The locals avoid those woods like the plague. Scared to death of the place they are." "Interesting. I'm not really superstitious," I said. "But granted, it is very disturbing how those men died. I don't like the sound of their heads being on sticks. That's what they did in the olden days when people committed atrocious crimes. It was a way of scaring the hoi polloi off by saying that this will happen to you if you step out of line, if you get my drift. It was a way of controlling the masses to make them fastidiously keep the law. And fear-breaking it, I suppose." "Disturbing, isn't it?" said the young man. "Their deaths were morbidly grim. You still want to go and stay at Mrs. Van Dyke's cabin after what I have told you?" "Yes, I do. I promised I'd look after her 2 cats. To be fair, she did warn me about the forest, told me not to go into it at night. I gather one of her previous cat-sitters did a runner after claiming to have seen an abominable snowman and being chased out of the woods by the grotesque monster. I didn't know what to make of that." The young man's blue eyes grew as wide as saucers. "You still want to stay there after she told you that? I believe the story. I do. And I'm not a gullible type. But the Whispering Woods, I've heard stories, dreadful stories about the place. You must need your head examining really hard. People claim when you enter the woods at night, you hear whispering. Some claim they've heard their own names being called. I believe it. Once when I was wandering over there, I heard something calling my name, hence the name Whispering Woods. Well, I've no intention of navigating those woods at night, if that's what you mean, especially after what you and Mrs. Van Dyke have told me. I still say that Miss Van Dyke woman is off her head. I can't believe she brought that land over 25 years ago, having learnt about the gruesome murders. Well, maybe she got a good price, I suggested. Could you tell me where the cabin is? The young man gave me directions and said, "Good luck, mate. You're really going to need it."
I found myself driving down a precipitous dirt road that looked novel and unfamiliar to me. But sure enough, when I took a left-hand turn in the road, I came to a quaint little gate with a sign Whispering Wood Cabin on it. The gate was open, so I drove down the dirt road, siphoning up a ton of dust in the process, until I was parked outside the little enchanting cabin that seemed to warmly welcome me. I remember feeling a flutter of excitement in my heart, almost as if I had butterflies flapping around in my chest. I studied the cabin closely. I was in the middle of nowhere, quite literally, just how I liked it. This cabin was going to be my playground for the next couple of weeks. It looked like something out of a whimsical fairy tale. Granted, the cabin was old, rustic, rudimentary, but it had been built with a resourceful imagination, innovative brilliance, and artistic ingenuity, as if someone had drawn an ambitious fairy tale cabin, and a carpenter had recreated the magic into our reality. It was situated on the fringe of the woods, that was really only 50 feet away from the cabin. The front part of the wooden cabin overlooked a sumptuous flowery meadow, sprawling out a fair distance, until it was neatly hemmed in by a wooden picket fence. This property belonged to a local farmer. You could see his horses frolicking happily in the noonday sun, under the blissful canopy of a cobalt blue sky. In the furthest distance was the undulating rise and fall of the mountains. The lowest stocky part was heavily wooded with green trees. But as they rose ever upwards, emerging through this green oasis, you could behold their rugged nakedness and sculptural contours, a magnificence that grabbed your attention with a wondrous awe, for the views were indeed spectacular to behold. I ventured to my trunk with a skip to my step, a broad smile upon my face. I was going to thoroughly enjoy it here, I thought. I quickly unloaded my shopping, placing it into the quaint white cupboards, into the tiny little kitchenette there, along with all the perishables in the gas-powered refrigerator cum freezer. The 2 cats were sunning themselves on the couch. They bounded down eagerly from their cosy perches and wobbled towards me, their purring engines firing on all cylinders as they rubbed their ample bodies against me, carpeting my legs in a plethora of fine hairs. Luckily I didn't suffer from asthma, or I would have certainly been in trouble. Over the next week I settled down happily in the cabin. Soon all thoughts about the Whispering Woods had abandoned me, including the speculative, fictitious stories I'd been hearing. I was sure someone with an overactive creative imagination had possibly made them up, as stories about haunted woods were legendary. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, a day I will never ever forget as long as I live, that I decided to take a hike and a picnic lunch into the wood grove. It was a spectacular, glorious day. The forest was sparkling, it was so green, as recently there had been a great deal of rain in West Virginia. The vegetation was richly lush, lavishly resplendent. The forest was no exception. As I ambled into the woods, my breath was stolen for a moment, as I soaked in the splendiferous views like a hungry, ravenous sponge with an insatiable thirst. It was like I had entered a magical green wonderland, as the forest floor was carpeted with verdant mosses, large green feathery umbrella-like ferns, vines, shrubs, woodland wildflowers in pinks, purples, yellows, blues and whites. When I walked along some of the woodland trails, I found blackberry and blueberry bushes growing wildly, boasting branches bursting with fat, delicious sweet fruit that had not yet been eaten by the deer. For a while I picked some of that fruit and eagerly gorged on it. Why did it taste so spectacular, so much better than the berries you buy in the supermarkets? I cautiously climbed up the precipitous incline. I noticed that there was a plethora of different tree species, a fabulous mix of sugar maples, beeches, yellow birches, black cherries, hemlocks, ashes and oaks, all tall, majestic and reasonably mature. I marvelled at how the sunlight twinkled through the branches, bespeckling the forest floor in flattering infusions of light that would have made a lighting engineer fully satisfied with such a beguiling result. The bird's song filtered through the valley. I became lost in my swirling thoughts. My hunger eluded and evaded me. I completely forgot about eating lunch. That was when I realised it was getting dark. I needed to be getting back soon. I did hasten my speed, due to all the obsequious rumours and lamentable speculation I had heard about the whistling woods at night. I glanced briefly at my watch. Goodness gracious me, it was 6:30 already. To this day I've never known a day to swallow or devour the time so quickly, like a ravenous orca. One minute the forest was light, the next it was dark. The bird's song vanished, but the crickets and frogs were on mute, for they refused to serenade the night. I glanced around me, having lost all sense of my bearings. I felt confused, disorientated, not entirely sure which way I'd actually come. I opened my rucksack and put on a headlamp, something I always took out on hiking trips, just as a precautionary measure. But even with the light of my lamp, everything looked unfamiliar, strange, out of place, almost as if the woodgrove had been rearranged, for I didn't recognise anything at all. I could feel the panic rising up in me. The nauseous taste of bile could be discerned on my tongue. I could hear Mrs. Van Dyke's voice warning me not to go into the forest at night, and the young blonde-haired man that had cautioned me about the whistling woods. I could hear his words in my mind. They seemed so haunting. "I have to say, you're a braver man than most," he'd said to me. "Get a grip," I told myself. "For goodness sake, hold it together, Freddie. This is just a forest, and that's all there is to it. None of those stories are true. They're just legends or rumours. If you focus on fairy tales, you'll lose all sense of your perspective." I tried to believe my words, but they fell on deaf ears. The woodgrove seemed hauntingly inauspicious, bodeful, unfavourable. A ghastly smell of death and decay hung in the forest, overtaking the pretty smells of pine and wild flowers. What was that hideous smell, I wondered? Was something deceased lying in the woods, rotting away? But why had I not encountered the smell earlier? It seemed to come in waves. One moment the smell was very pronounced. Then it mysteriously disappeared. I could feel that I was not alone. Something was watching me. I stood very still. I surveyed my surroundings, but everything was unnervingly quiet. It wasn't natural. For there to be no sounds, something was seriously off-kilter. Should not the crickets and frogs be making an appearance tonight? It would seem every night I had heard them from the cabin without fail. But now there was nothing. Not even the hoot of an owl, or the long-distant call of a coyote. Silence has an inauspicious sound of its own, for the emptiness of nature's audible vibrations makes you aware that you are conspicuously alone. It makes you ever heedful of your defenceless disposition, your powerless vulnerability. For without the sounds in the forest, it is as if everything is stripped naked and bare. Ostensibly, most usually, the forest and her sounds are unanimously made one. But when the sounds are estranged or alienated from her, something is out of alignment. Something is seriously off. I could feel the eyes on me again. How could I feel something looking at me but see nothing? It made no sense at all. I needed to study my environment more closely. Something was out there, looming in the dark shadows. Something dangerous, something foreboding, something portentous, something evil. That was when I noticed a tree trunk moving. But the trees in the forest were still, for not even a wind was blowing at this moment. For even the wind had taken a brief respite, to exacerbate the quietness of this airy moment in time that sent shivers of impending dread darting down my spine like singular electric shocks. This tree trunk was now stationary, but I was certain that only moments before it had moved. Had my eyes deceived me? Was it a trick of the light? Oh my goodness, the tree trunk has eyes, I thought. I could see a red eye blinking at me. It opened and closed its lashes, shut its lids. My blood went cold, my hair stood up on end, my breath was confiscated briefly by my shock. I saw the red eye blink again, and then the still form began to move surreptitiously towards me. At first his movements were deliberately slow, graceful, imposing, no real immediate threat. Then there he was, standing before me, only 3 feet away. I could feel his vaporous, stinking breath on me. In the darkness of the early evening, with my headlamp on my head, the soft shadows of silvery moonlight danced through the trees. Everything was hauntingly surreal, as my eyes tried to adjust to the light, as they consumed what I was seeing with an apprehensive appreciation. The creature had a very distinctive, large pyramid-shaped head, with an ape-like face, overlong arms. He was covered with long, flowing black hair that was as black as coal. His eyes blazed like 2 bright red traffic lights. The next thing I knew, the creature sneezed so loudly that I almost jumped out of my skin. I was so frightened. I could see the thin lips of the creature twitch and lift up ever so slowly. For a moment he looked like he might be smiling at me. But I was wrong, very wrong. The creature began to growl at me. At first it was a low, guttural growl, but it escalated in frequency and volume, sounding distinctly like a lion. My heart began to pound. I could hear every single heartbeat. I knew I needed to run, but fear consumed me, devouring my confidence, my sense of perspective, my sound reasoning, like a bottomless inferno. For a moment I felt frozen to the spot, but something inside me jerked me violently out of my immobilized state, like a powerful cautionary inward nudge. I needed no further prompting. I began to run. I could feel I'd wet myself, as in my panic the warm urine trickled down my legs, but nothing stopped me in my interminable drive to get away as fast as I possibly could. I felt like a hunted animal, my life flashing before me in a series of fast pictures, as nostalgic, wistful memories of my early childhood snapped in my mind like a fast motion picture. I knew I was living on borrowed time, time that was fast running out, like the sand in an hourglass. I could feel it in my bones, in my marrow, in my sinew, in every cell of my body. I knew this was it. It was lights out. In a matter of seconds, my life would be extinguished. So with every ounce of energy that I could conjure up in my body, with all my strength and power, I gathered all my physical and mental resources together, along with my wit, and ran like I have never run before, with this creature trailing behind me. Yet despite my very best efforts, he seized the collar of my polo shirt in his hands, dragged me towards him, so I fell back clumsily onto the earthen floor like a large, cumbersome sack of potatoes. I found myself staring up into furious red eyes that were filled with an incandescent rage. I closed my eyes, surrendering to my fate. But I let out a shrill scream that travelled through the forest like a blaring horn or a siren. The next thing I knew is another Bigfoot came darting through the woods. She was female, with a human-like face. She screamed at the other Bigfoot that had grabbed me by the collar. To my amazement, he stepped away from me. She screamed at him again, staring at him with deep, furious brown eyes that were almost daring him to challenge her. He took a few more steps away. He seemed intimidated by this gutsy female. The female threw me over her shoulders like I was a feather. She glided with me through the woods. She ran like the wind. I physically relaxed. I could smell the creature's hair. She smelt of woodland pine. She smelt of the earth. She smelt of the rain. She smelt of the wild flowers of the valley. She moved with an effortless speed and grace, like a cheetah, never once jolting me, for even riding a horse was never this smooth or seamless. Indeed, so swift was she that before I knew it I was standing outside my cabin. How did she know even where I lived? The creature pointed to the woods. I heard her saying in my head, "Don't go there at night. He will kill you. He's very territorial." I looked into the creature's eyes. She was so different to the other Bigfoot in every regard, so human, so compassionate, so kind, like a completely different species. The female stood watching me until I was safely back in the cabin, and then, happy that I was safe and sound, she glided away.
I could hardly believe I was alive. The profound gratitude I felt to have come out of such a dangerous situation was monumental. I heard of people having chance encounters with lions and other wild cats before, and by all accounts they've not come out unscathed. I certainly felt like celebrating, for my gratitude of being alive was insatiable. I think the 2 fat cats, used to their diet kibble, were surprised to be presented with chicken and fish that evening. I was celebrating my life, and both cats were going to join me in the celebration, and to hell with their waistlines. From thenceforth I decided I was never ever going to go into that wood grove after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, as the rumours of the whispering forest were indeed true. You don't want to be wandering in there at night. It was in the nights that followed I would wake up to hear something walking around my cabin. I glanced out of the cabin window. I would see the female Bigfoot that had rescued me patrolling the area. When she saw me looking at her through the windows, she nodded at me. I realized she was watching over me, like a centurion on guard duty, protecting me from the big male. I made sure every night I put snacks out for her, usually peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, bacon butties, chips, chocolate chip cookies and grapes. She would tap on the window with the plate in her hand and nod, as if she was saying thank you. I would watch her walking around eating my food. She seemed to be thoroughly enjoying it. When I got the plate back, there were 2 twigs placed upwards and 1 horizontal in the shape of an H. I think it's a Bigfoot sign for thank you. When Mrs. Van Dyke returned from her trip to England, she was heartily relieved to see that I was still at the cabin, taking care of her 2 big cats, who she claimed had got significantly fatter under my charge. I admit I had the decency to look bashful about that. I'm so glad you heeded my advice. I knew if you went into the wood grove you would not be here when I got back. But it seems that you abided by my judicious instructions. Well done. Little did she know that against my own wishes I had become ensnared in that forest at night, but I was not about to reveal that secret to her. When I told Sheila my story, she stared at me in amazement, as tears spilled down her face. I think you've made my nightmare reach a happy conclusion. I never get to the part where the other Bigfoot intervenes and rescues you. Well, maybe because it's the trauma that is recorded in the kidney. But let me tell you, Sheila, there's no doubt in my mind you experienced my horrific Bigfoot encounter. Without a doubt in my mind. My cells have replayed the events to you, rather like a memory. I think I understand now why haunted houses often carry the signature of a traumatic event. May I ask you, Freddie, what's your favourite food in the entire world? That's a strange question for you to ask me. Here, said Sheila, write it down on a piece of paper. I'll write down mine. Then we'll compare notes. Also write down your favourite dessert on a separate piece of paper. Are you being serious? I said. Very well, I'll do it. We both proceeded to write down our favourite dishes. I'm going first, said Sheila proudly. She turned over her paper. It read, creamed spinach, buttered pumpkin, potato chips, sticky spare ribs. I looked at her agog. I turned around my paper. It read exactly the same. I don't understand. I donated a kidney to you, not all the other organs in my body, surely. Turn around your paper for your best dessert, Sheila said. Apple pie and ice cream. Me too. Once again, we had both written down our favourite dessert, and it was a perfect match. Do you know what I would have written down before my kidney transplant? I would have put down margarita pizza, and for pudding it would have been lemon meringue pie. Now I crave meat all the time. Before I received your kidney, I was a proud vegetarian, with not even a teensy-weensy bit of a desire for meat. Wow, well, that is something, isn't it? Another thing is, well, I've become quite solitary. I don't like to party anymore. I'm quite independent. I like my own company, and I adore nature. In a nutshell, I suppose I'm the perfect woman for you. She flushed with embarrassment. Well, only on paper, of course. Only on paper? Well, that's a bit of a pity, isn't it? Sheila looked at me. You feel it too? You feel a stirring between us? I nodded. Even before the kidney transplant, I felt it. Sheila grabbed my hand. Let's go for a walk, she said, looking into my eyes. Has anyone told you, Freddie, that you have a beautiful smile? My heart almost missed a beat as she held her hand in mine. We walked around the park, enjoying the views.
finally sitting under the shade of an oak tree. She turned around and kissed me on the lips. And that was that. I'm very glad to tell you, 25 years later, and with another successful kidney transplant behind her, Sheila and I are happily married. So our story is serendipitous, as against all odds we came together in such unlikely circumstances. With her new kidney, she did develop a craving for carrot juice and for chocolate ice cream. So I wouldn't mind hedging a bet that the previous owner of her kidneys hankered after these very foods. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I never imagined it would be remotely possible that I'd end up accused of murdering one of my best friends, a young man I went to school with called Thomas Harding. Me and Thomas had been bosom buddies since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. We would rough it together in our green leafy neighbourhood, where we grew up in Portland, riding our bicycles up and down the street, climbing trees in the backyard, or playing cops and robbers, or with some of our remote-operated toy cars and aeroplanes. Boy stuff like that. We also became Boy Scouts, and when we were older, at the age of about 18, my father taught the two of us how to hunt. I don't mind admitting I was quite a dab hand with a rifle, an excellent shot, although in truth I hated killing anything, even if it was ultimately for the greater good. Thomas Harding was such a good friend of mine. He was my best friend. I was the level-headed one, prudent, always pragmatic. Unfortunately, Thomas was far too impulsive for his own good. It would seem his reckless, capricious actions always landed him in a whole heap of trouble. He was the type that would imprudently apply the accelerator, impetuously leaping into a situation without putting on the brakes first to ensure he was thinking sagaciously before intervening in something that might not end up terribly well for him. I remember on one occasion when two boys were arguing at a gas station about something, they began to get caught up in a nasty brawl. Thomas instinctively ran over to the two men. He began to reason with them and break up their fight. The two men who'd been fighting each other unleashed their wrath on him. Thomas ended up really badly beaten up. I know he was well-meaning, but a more savvy, astute person would have called the police first and never intervened in the way that Thomas had done. He would have walked away then, unscathed, but Thomas tended to delay his thinking and always react first, which was not in his best interests. I remember even when my sister Pamela was about 10 years old, Thomas had his eyes on her. So from a young age I discerned he really liked my sister. I remember it bothered me immensely. Pamela was my only sibling, and even at 10 years old she was a strikingly pretty girl, but as innocent, shy and whimsically naive as a mountain doe. I had a sinking, sententious feeling that one day Thomas might date my sister. I cunningly tried to put him off her by saying derogatory, off-putting things about her that weren't actually true, but nothing ever worked. I remember once pretending my sister was interested in becoming a Muslim. I thought that his interest in her would surely wane, as his family was very religious, but it certainly seemed that Thomas was not at all put off. In fact, he said, "Oh, how interesting! Your sister is full of surprises. I like it. I like it very much." I could see when I talked about her, or he saw her at my home, he would look at her like a love-struck puppy. It was pathetic. The last thing I would ever want is for my best friend to go out with my sister, as it could end up becoming exceedingly awkward, especially if things were to go badly wrong. I treasured my friendship with Thomas, far too much for things to sour between us. But I had no idea how to put a stop to a wildfire that could potentially get out of control. Then it happened, just as I had anticipated, only it was a whole lot worse than I could have ever envisaged. One day when my sister was about 21 and Thomas was about 23, the two of them began to date. I was candid and forthright over my reservations towards their relationship. "Thomas, you and I are the very best of friends," I had said. "Please, I beg you, don't date my sister. If you hurt her, I will never be able to forgive you. You know how protective I am towards my younger sister. I would walk the ends of the earth for her, you know I would, as her older brother. I've always stuck my neck out for her. If things were to go wrong between you and my sister, it could potentially destroy our friendship. Now I would hate that to happen.
Look, bro, I fancied Pamela since I was 10 years old. She's the girl I want to marry one day. I'm never going to mess her around or hurt her. You and I are going to be brothers-in-law one day, not just best friends. Don't you worry about me or your sister. But we are like brothers anyway, I protested. Nothing is ever going to change that. You don't need to be my brother-in-law.
I'd even spoken to Thomas's mother about how much I wished she'd discourage her son to not date my sister. I really liked Mrs. Harding. She was a kind of approachable person that you could talk to about pretty much anything. As a youngster, I would so much rather go to her about any personal problems I might have than speak to my own mother any day of the week, which is something I always did. So I was very close to my friend's mother. I always found my draconian, aloof mother somewhat unapproachable. Mrs. Harding always seemed to relate to me. She was a distinguished contemporary artist, producing incredible work that sold all over North America. She'd often whisk me into her art studio for my opinion on a piece. "What do you think about this work, Oliver?" she asked me, with her bright eyes fixed on me intently. I knew she'd never take offence if I expressed any dislike to any of her pieces. She certainly valued my opinion. I loved art, so I respected her ingenious work, in a way that Thomas could not. I think he thought his mother just threw splotches of coloured paint onto canvas and scribbled with markers to make a lovely chaotic mess that you could not take seriously. He failed to savour all the layering of the work, the attention to detail incorporated in the piece, and how spectacular it looked on the wall. In his opinion, a 3-year-old could have created that work, which was so far from the truth, but he failed to see that. He would tease his mother and say, "Another big scribble, Mum." I personally embraced the textures, shapes, colour markings, scribbles, scratches and tonal contrasts she applied to her work. Mrs. Harding also dressed like an artist. Well, I think she did. She was a very slender woman who shunned all things tight. She would wear stylish black tunic dresses, flowing with large pieces of contemporary jewellery hanging from a leather string around her neck, complemented by a pair of bright glittering sandals with a leather anklet on her manicured feet, while her blonde hair was swept away from her face in a sweeping ponytail, tied together with a leather bow. She said artists never liked to wear tight, constricted clothes. As much like their art, their clothes needed to be soft and flowing in order to feel free to express themselves. "You need wings to fly," she would exclaim, "not a corset to tie you down to the earth and to suppress your breathing. I don't get these skinny jeans and these tight-fitting clothes," she'd say. "They're absolutely frightful. Women think it makes them look attractive, but the reverse is true. Some of them look like they're wearing a colourful sausage wrapper and trussed up so tightly they can't actually breathe." "Please speak to Thomas about this, Mrs. Harding," I'd implored her with beseeching eyes. "I don't want him going out with Pamela. It's too close for comfort. It really is. Surely there are other girls out there he can date. Why does he have to pick my sister? It's not a wise move on his part. Can you not see it's a disaster waiting to happen?" "Oh, I wish I could stop him, sweetheart," said Mrs. Harding, looking at me sorrowfully. "But you know Thomas. He can be doggedly determined at times, especially when he sets his mind on something. Then he goes for it like a NASA rocket, bulleting up into the clouds with a mighty bang. There's absolutely nothing you can do to stop him. He's unbridled, like a wild horse you can't control or break in. He takes after his father, he does. The two of them are like peas in a pod, stubborn as mules, headstrong and contrary to the core. But can't you at least have words with him?" "Oh, believe me," chuckled Mrs. Harding, "I've already tried that. It didn't work. He wouldn't listen. When it comes to Thomas, I'd be better off arguing with a brick wall than with him. He's so annoyingly unyielding." "I agree with you, Oliver. It's not a good idea. But what can I do about it? Nothing." I had then tried another approach by addressing my sister Pamela. I'd said, "Please, don't go out with Thomas. It's not a good idea. I don't want to fall out with my best friend. If things were to go pear-shaped in your relationship and you got badly hurt, I don't want to have to pick up the pieces and console your broken heart. If Thomas hurts you, I'd never be able to forgive him. And I value my friendship with him. Please end things now before it's too late."
But my ominous words fell on deaf ears. My sister looked at me with sparkling blue eyes that twinkled with joyful happiness. "But I can't do that, Oliver. Not even for you. You know I would if I could, but I've rarely fallen for Thomas, and he has for me. This is not something that we can stop." "Oh, God," I groaned, "the two of you have got it bad." Of course I knew Mrs. Harding was right. Both Pamela and Thomas had become as thick as thieves. At this stage of their relationship, it would take more than a heavy-duty tractor to drive a wedge between the two of them. They were as set on each other as much as a tadpole is intent on turning into a frog. If the process runs smoothly, the outcome would be secured. But what? What if it didn't? And that was the problem. I will not deny that I was troubled. My dubious concern grew exponentially with every passing day, as something deep down in my gut gave me an unsettling, disturbing feeling that things were not going to end up well between the two of them. It seemed my foreboding premonition was right on the money. The relationship between the two of them had blossomed at a Sunday barbecue at my home of all things. It was a fabulous party that my parents were hosting, where they'd invited most of the neighbourhood, including the Hardings. I remember Thomas took one look at my sister, completely ignored me, and walked towards her with a determined stance, like a man with a mission that would be accomplished come hell or high water. He had gravitated towards my sister that evening, and they only had eyes for each other. You could feel the electricity between them as they talked and talked. It was as if they were in their own little bubble, and everyone else at the party was just background noise. I couldn't even steal Thomas away for a casual chat. I naturally felt affronted, for Thomas never ever gave me a fleeting glance at that party. It was clear that everyone noticed the chemistry between the two of them, and in that moment I felt the nauseous taste of bile rise up in the back of my throat. "Darling, don't be so upset," my mother had said. "Why, I think your sister and Thomas make such a delightful couple, and I know that Thomas will be a very good son-in-law," she had said approvingly. Then it happened. Granted, it was 1.5 years later, but it happened as I anticipated. At this stage of the relationship, it had seemed that Thomas and Pamela were almost certainly destined for the altar, as they were very much in love with each other. But something transpired that set the cat among the pigeons. My sister was speaking to her friend on her cell when I was making coffee in the kitchen. I overheard her conversation. "When did this happen?" "No, that can't be. You've got to be mistaken. Thomas would never do that to me. He's steadfastly loyal, you know he is. That's not possible. It can't be." At the name of my friend, I turned around to listen to my sister's conversation. My antennae were literally on full alert. What the heck was going on? What had Thomas done? I had this admonition, a feeling of impending dread that loomed over me like a dark thundercloud. My sister's eyes were filling with tears. "Thanks for telling me, Clara. I'm going to give Thomas a call, find out what's going on. I'm sure you must be mistaken. He'd never do that to me. He's not like that." I could hear the uncertainty trail in her voice, as now she was beginning to wonder if she had misjudged her relationship with Thomas, as an oppressive doubt began to set in. "What's going on?" I asked, watching my sister earnestly. "What's Thomas done?" "That's what I'm about to find out," said Pamela. "My friend Clara seems to be under the impression that Thomas got completely bladdered at the Ashford barbecue. Remember, I couldn't go. I had an awful migraine headache. Well, apparently Sophie Ashford, who's always fancied Thomas, was ploughing him with drink all night, flirting with him outrageously. She then escorted him to her studio flat. Clara said she saw the two of them in bed together, getting it on, so to speak, in a passionate frenzy. She says there was no doubt in her mind what she saw. It was very graphic, almost as if Sophie wanted to be seen. You know, she's always been an exhibitionist like that." "But Thomas would never do that to you. He's not that kind of chap. I should know. He's my best friend." "Exactly," said Pamela, blinking away the tears. Maybe she saw someone that looked a lot like Thomas, and it's a case of misidentification. I mean, let's face it, there are men that look alike, with dark hair and blue eyes like him." I'm going to find out now from the horse's mouth. Thomas will be able to tell me if that was him. Oliver? Oliver? She grabbed me by my arm. You don't think it's true, do you? Please don't say you do. I don't know, sis. I really don't know. Your friend seems very certain she saw Thomas. Why would she make an unlikely story like that up? By all accounts, she knows Thomas well. So why would she be confused? Why would she mistake him for another bloke? I would like you to put your phone on speaker, I said. I want to hear what Thomas has to say to you about this. As I was ready and eager to give my friend the benefit of the doubt. My friend would not cheat on my sister, surely. Hi, came Thomas's voice at the end of the phone. How's it going, Cottontail? Which was his pet name for Pamela. My friend told me something disturbing, Thomas, but I said she got it horribly wrong, that there must be a dreadful mistake. I know you'd never do anything like this to me. She said you slept with Sophie Ashford at the Ashford barbecue, in her downstairs studio flat. But I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. Tell me you didn't do anything like that. Who said I did that? Came the voice. Clara said it. And you're going to believe what that nasty cow has to say about me? That's not very nice of you, Cottontail. Get real. That girl has always been jealous of our relationship from day one. She made the whole thing up. She's lying through her teeth. You know she is. But why would she do that? Protested my sister. You're wrong about Clara. She'd never want to hurt me deliberately. She's a very good friend. I could tell immediately that Thomas was lying. I knew him well enough by now to discern the pitch of his voice when he was telling a porky. Did you speak to Sophie Ashford at the party? My sister asked Thomas. So what if I did? I spoke to a lot of people there. It doesn't mean that I went and slept with her, does it? I grabbed the cell from my sister. Thomas, it's me, Oliver. Now you tell my sister the truth. She needs to know. Did you or did you not sleep with Sophie Ashford? Be honest now. Don't fob us off with any lies. There was a silence at the end of the phone, as Thomas was never inclined to lie to me. Over all the years I had known him, he had never once told me a lie. All right, I admit it. I got wasted. It happened, but it's not a big deal. It meant nothing. The girl, she was all over me. She was literally throwing herself at me. I got swept away in the moment. It kind of happened, but I really regret it now in the cold light of day. I wish I could take it back. I'm ashamed of what I did. I'm sorry, Cottontail. It really meant nothing. My sister grabbed the telephone from me. It meant nothing, but you slept with Sophie Ashford. How could you? You cheated on me, Thomas, she said, the tears pouring down her face. How could you do that to me? I thought we loved each other. I thought you were the one. You've broken my heart, Thomas. I'll never be able to trust another man again because of you. You're the last person in the world I thought would ever do this to me. I'm sorry, Cottontail. I really am. It's you I love. I got so drunk, I didn't know what I was doing. You knew what you were doing, Thomas. You knew. Believe me, you did. Well, it's over between us, Thomas. I never, ever am going to forgive you for this. Do you hear me? Never, ever. Cottontail, don't do this. It was a terrible mistake. All right, I messed up, but it will never happen again, I promise. You heard my sister, Thomas, I said, grabbing the phone from her. Get lost, and don't you ever come near my sister again. Do you hear me? My sister began to sob and sob and sob. The tears poured down her face like raindrops. I can't believe he did this to me, Oliver. How could he? I really loved him, and he does this. I thought he was the one. I really did. It was all I could do not to go straight around to Thomas's house, punch his lights out, and throttle him within an inch of his life. I was incandescent. I could feel the rage coursing through my veins, but I restrained myself from doing anything stupid that I might live to regret. I'd never resorted to physical altercations or violence before, and I wasn't about to start now. I took my sister lovingly in my arms. She sobbed on me until my shirt was drenched by her tears.
It was so sopping wet I could have wrung it out like a piece of washed laundry.
"Forget about Thomas," I said to her. "You are far too good for him. He has no right to treat you in this deplorable way. If he cannot see that, he does not deserve you. I don't know what made him blow caution to the wind and behave like this. Thomas has lost leave of his senses, that is for sure. I don't know what has got into him."
In the days and weeks that followed, I cut up my ties with Thomas. He had broken my sister's heart, and I didn't want anything more to do with my childhood best friend. I had presumed that this would happen, and it did. I missed Thomas like hell, but I was between a rock and a hard place. My sister had to be my first priority. She was cut up to the core about Thomas, believing him to be the one that she would one day marry. He had shredded her hopes and dreams into thousands of tiny pieces. A month after my sister's breakup with Thomas, the anger I felt towards him was still bubbling beneath the surface, rather like a volcano that has the potential to erupt at any given moment. But I guess time had calmed me down significantly. Mrs. Harding gave me a phone call. "Hello, Oliver. We're missing you so much. You're like a second son to me. You know you are. I was hoping to get your judicious opinion with some of my artwork. It's been so long, far too long. I feel as if I haven't seen you forever."
"You do know what Thomas did to my sister. That's why I haven't been over to you, Mrs. Harding. It's awkward at the moment, with things the way they are. It's nothing personal."
There was a long, awkward pause at the end of the line. "I know. I don't know what to say, Oliver. I mean, what do I say in these inauspicious circumstances? I'm just dreadfully sorry about what happened. Of course, Thomas is furious with himself for getting inebriated at that barbecue. I'm angry with him about that. I really am. He made a big fool of himself. When you drink too much, you lose control of your inhibitions. Dreadful things can happen. I'm so dreadfully sorry he cheated on your sister, Oliver. I don't know what to say about that. I didn't bring him up to be such a Casanova. I honestly don't know what got into him. Of course, he's completely devastated about what happened between him and Pamela, for he really loves your sister. But even more so in losing your friendship. Can't the two of you patch things up together? It seems such a dreadful, dreadful shame for you to be at loggerheads with each other. Friendships like yours don't grow on trees. They come along once in a lifetime. It's an awful shame to throw it away like this. Some things in life are worth fighting for, and this is a friendship that deserves to be resurrected."
"I miss Thomas, and I miss you too, Mrs. Harding, but it's very difficult to get my head around what Thomas did to my sister."
"Of course, dear, I do understand that. But you must. If you are filled with unforgiveness, Oliver, it'll eat you alive. One thing we need to learn in life is that none of us are perfect. We slip up from time to time. We all do. We're not infallible. We're human, for goodness sake. We all make dreadful mistakes. And sometimes, Oliver, forgiveness needs to be employed."
"You're right about that," I admitted. "I am far from perfect."
"Well, I'll tell you what I've done. Now, please forgive me for being so presumptuous, but there's a fabulous hunting lodge outside of Portland where the two of you can go hunting for the day. It's in an isolated spot, lots of land. I think the two of you spending some quality time out in nature together will do you the world of good. It'll be incredibly bonding for the both of you. You have so much making up to do. And I think you owe it to each other to give your friendship a second chance. Please, Oliver, say yes, and I'll organise it right away. All on me, of course."
"Fine," I said. "I'll meet him at the hunting lodge myself. We'll go in separate trucks, just in case things get overheated between us."
"Fair enough," said Mrs. Harding. "Oliver, I just want to say thanks. I'm so thankful to you for being the bigger person. I know Thomas will be over the moon. He's been very down in the dumps lately. He's been so subdued without his best friend in his life." I do not know why I'd agreed to go to this hunting lodge to meet Thomas, but the truth was I missed him an awful lot. I hadn't seen him for over a month now. I was deeply upset by what he'd done to my sister, for she was still very broken up about the break-up. Ostensibly it was demoralising for her self-esteem to think he'd cheated on her so easily. I knew that Mrs. Harding was absolutely right. It would be wrong to hold a grudge against my best friend forever. Sometimes you're better off forgiving someone's indiscretions if you've cared about them all your life. It would be such a waste to throw our friendship away, rather like a carcass to the dogs. But despite all of that, I couldn't fathom why Thomas had behaved in such a despicable way in the very first place, for it was so unlike his character. By all accounts, he was a loyal, steadfast person. Normally, when I went to the hunting lodge, I was usually pretty excited, but on this occasion the trepidation I felt was all-consuming. It blanketed me in a carpet of unease. I began to sweet-talk myself around to trying to focus on my positive friendship with Thomas before it was hit by a tsunami of devastation when he broke my sister's heart so treacherously. Thomas was waiting for me at the hunting lodge. It was so good to see him again. For a moment I forgot about my sister as we embraced warmly. "I'm sorry, bro," said Thomas, his forehead furrowing with many lines. I'm really sorry. I don't know what else to say." "Let's not go there. I'd rather us focus on our hunting today. Let's have some fun." I must admit Thomas looked heartily relieved. It was as if his jaws that were physically clenched relaxed, and he gave me a thankful smile, as if he was ever grateful to be let off the hook. The hunting lodge was not well known by many people. According to Mrs. Harding, it was her husband's best-kept secret, a private lodge that only welcomed a handful of guests at one time. It gained all its illustrious bookings not through advertising, but by word of mouth. To all intents and purposes, that was all that was needed to gain an extra income. I gather the lodge had several luxurious wooden cabins for guests to enjoy staying there overnight, for the week, the weekend, or a greater period of time. But Thomas and I were there just for the day, so we weren't privy to seeing any of these cabins. But if the lodge was anything to go by, they must be fabulously cosy and exceedingly well appointed. The main lodge was like a substantial extended wooden cabin, with a large foyer that opened out into a luxurious dining room, lounge, library, bathroom and main kitchen. The wooden walls were decorated with framed black and white photographs of hunting scenes that had been taken exclusively at the lodge over the years. There were superb head-mounted deers with very large racks, staring at you from the walls with lifelike eyes that seemed so real you felt as if you were being watched. The lavishly appointed deluxe extravagant furnishings at the lodge were so stylishly elegant, the kind of sumptuous sofas that you could slip into by a large cosy fire, falling fast asleep, for they are indeed more comfortable than a bed. Needless to say, all the living rooms had very substantial-sized fireplaces, so I imagine in the middle of the winter, with the fire crackling away happily in the hearth, it must have been incredibly hearty and cheerful. The lodge was owned by a very warm-hearted, congenial, retired couple. We were just here for the day, but it already felt as if I had left all my cares behind me in Portland. There is something about the fresh air of the countryside that seems to serenade you when you arrive in a place like this, tucked away like a verdant, sparkling jewel, in the middle of nowhere. It seems to welcome you with a warm, convivial hug that makes you instantly relax. It releases your inhibitions so that you feel like an eagle, ready to ascend and soar into the sky, as the opportunities that lie before you seem bounteously unlimited. The lodge had packed us a delectable, delicious picnic basket, so armed with our rifles, off we went on our merry way. We hadn't even bothered to scout the area. It didn't really matter. I think we were going to take pot luck anyway, follow some random deer tracks and scat, possibly use one of the secured hiking stands that we might find, and hope beyond hope we would hit the jackpot. And if we didn't, well, it wouldn't be a big deal, as we were here to enjoy being out in nature. If we killed a deer, it would just be the cherry on the cake, nothing less or nothing more. We were both wearing orange vests over our camouflage clothes, as there were a couple of other hunters out today, 2 men from the United Kingdom, but with all this land to choose from, the chances of running into them were reasonably slim, I thought. It would seem that Thomas knew this hunting lodge remarkably well. I gather he'd been here a few times before. He told me he knew the quintessential perfect spot for us to hunt, as the lodge always threw out apples in the specific area to attract the deer, and this particular hunting stand happened to overlook a watering hole, so it sounded good to me. We were using an acorn cover spray to cover up our human odours. It was one that came highly recommended by the lodge, which meant wild animals would be unable to detect our human-like odours. We walked through this awesome woodgrove, made up primarily of long, slender vertical shapes of imposing Douglas firs, logpole pines, ponderosa pines and larches, that penciled up into the sky like tall, thin men, swathed in luxurious green garments. The furthest distance was framed with the subtle impressions of imposing mountainous valleys with their voluptuous undulating curves that billowed up into the bruised skyline in soft shades of purples, pinks and blues. Me and Thomas ambled happily through the sumptuous wood grove. There were extensive areas of umbrage, dappled in shade, where rugged rocks jutted through the forest floor, covered in bountiful layers of rich green moss. There was a plethora of feathery ferns, as well as pretty ground covers, like field mint, Smith fairy bells, marsh violets, blue aster, valerian, goat's beard, and of course tight little congregations of cute little fungi. What I loved about this wood grove is it zigzagged into these fabulous open clearings and then swept back into the forest like a vast sprawling house with resplendent open and closed bedrooms. One minute you were in a highly shaded penumbra, covered by a bountiful leafy canopy, bejewelled with the bronze boughs of pretty needled leaves, only permitting the tiniest sprinkles of pearly light to trinkle daintily through the branches, casting their ethereal shadows onto the dark, fertile earthen floor. Then on the next corner it would open out into a spacious clearing, where you would be encompassed by a cobalt blue sky, while the ground was richly carpeted with long grasses interspersed with pretty wild flowers. The forest tinkled brightly with sounds of bird song. It smelt richly of moss, earth and wild flowers, while the ponderosa pines infused the forest with the evocative sweet scent of butterscotch. Everything about the forest was engaging and magical. I felt my former anxiety melting away rather like the butter on a blueberry muffin. I'm so glad to say we did finally find the hunting stand that Thomas had heartily recommended, which was about 70 feet away from a large watering hole. It was a gem of a spot, really gorgeous, discreetly hidden between a cluster of Douglas fir trees, and there were many angles from the stand that were easily accessible for you to take a reasonable shot at a deer. It was built of metal amidst the trees, painted green to blend in with the scenery. It was fitted with fabulously comfortable chairs and a table, so it was a pretty cosy spot for a hunting stand. The watering hole was heavily fringed on the furthest side by weeping willows. Its silvery shimmering surface gleamed in the morning sun. By all accounts it was a spectacular day, and being out in nature made me forget my grievances with Thomas, as my attention was hijacked by the splendiferous wonders of the natural world. It felt nostalgically wistful, like old times as we silently sat and waited, hoping for a fleeting deer to pass by. It was a waiting game, but the two of us were ready to soak up the scenery and wait patiently for some deer to pass our way, if luck were to happen upon us, that is. We did see a few turkey, very large specimens, I might add. I was certainly tempted to take a shot, but we weren't here for turkey. Our mind was set on acquiring a deer. So we let the birds amble off. They were blindly oblivious to our presence. By lunchtime nothing had transpired, so we hungrily tucked into our turkey and cranberry sandwiches, laughing at the irony of eating turkey. Then I did something very stupid. I said, "Why, bro? Why did you cheat on my sister?" Thomas was eating a mouthful of his sandwich. He almost choked. "I thought you didn't want to open up that can of worms." "Well, I just want to know. I need to know. Help me to understand." Thomas frowned. "You know I was in love with your sister. I still am. I don't know what happened that night. I got as drunk as a skunk, and one thing led to another. You know how it does. I told you it meant nothing, Oliver. I know it sounds lame and pathetic, but it is what it is. I can't make excuses for myself, for there are none." I could feel the bile rising up in the back of my throat. Before I knew it, a heated rage began to swell up in my guts like sago pearls when exposed to water. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. I tried to restrain the wild dog inside of me, but with very little success, for the words fell out of my mouth. My eyes became fierce. I shouted at my friend, drawing attention to my human presence by pretty much telling the entire deer population that we were there hiding out in the deer stand. For some reason I had released the restraints of my polite demeanour. I had launched into a full-scale blowout with a rather bemused Thomas. "This is my sister we're talking about, in case you've forgotten. How could you have done that to her? My sister of all people.
You know how protective I am towards her. You broke her heart. She was in love with you. It was so destroying for me to witness my sister's pain. How do you think it made me feel? That my very best friend literally put a knife in her guts. Don't you think I bloody regret it, Oliver? There isn't a day that goes by that I don't bloody hate myself for what I did. It was alcohol talking. That girl, she was all over me. I couldn't stop myself. I scoffed. Nice try, bro, blaming the alcohol on your licentious behaviour.
Before I knew it, we were caught up in a blazing, raucous row. We were now at this stage at the bottom of the deer stand, screaming loud obscenities at each other like never before, using language that was vulgar, never having graced either of our lips for a lifetime. But it flowed out of our mouths as smoothly as a stream, meandering seamlessly along its narrow course. I'd never had a verbal altercation like this before with my friend. As things became inflamed and heated, I felt as if a festering old wound of my disgruntled indignance had broken open and was bleeding profusely. I'm surprised that I physically did not lash out at Thomas, but I repressed this insidious desire, restraining myself from going down that path, as employing a fist in an argument is just never cool. That was when we saw the two British men, both clad in their orange hunting vests that were worn over their camouflage gear, whom we had gleaned from the owners, were also staying at the lodge, involved in the hunting. They were the very last people we expected to encounter on this vast premises. It was nonsensical that of all the areas they should have chosen for their hunting, happened to be so conspicuously close to us. Far too close for comfort. Wasn't that rotten luck? But I suppose it happens. What do they say? Great minds think alike. The two men looked heartily annoyed with us, but then who could blame them? I would also be exceedingly pissed if I was wearing their boots. They were carrying their rifles and picnic baskets and looked exceedingly hacked off with us.
What's going on here? We were in a stand a short way away from here. We were this close to getting a deer, let me tell you, with our rifles, said the man, using his fingers to indicate a hair's breadth. We were about to fire at a marvellous-looking deer, and the sound of the two of you screaming the woodgrove down like a couple of deranged banshees rattled them considerably. They ran away like grease lightning. They won't be coming back in a hurry, so we lost our quarry. Thanks a bunch. We've been waiting all morning for the perfect shot. Then the two of you startle all the deer with your raucous row. We've been staying at the lodge for over 3 days now, and the moment we're about to take down a real beauty, with the kind of humongous antlers every aspiring hunter longs for, the two of you ruin everything for us. I hope you're jolly well pleased with yourselves. Sorry, I said. We didn't know you were so close by. It was rather unfortunate. That's not the point, mate. I don't give a toss about your apology anyway. It's far too late for that. Water under the bridge, so to speak, said one of the British chaps. Everyone knows the social etiquette when you're on a hunting retreat. You keep bloody quiet. Those are the rules. You've spoilt our quintessential opportunity to take down a perfect specimen today, with your selfish, apathetic indifference, by announcing our human presence to all the wild animals out here. We're going to have to move far away from this spot that you totalled for us so inauspiciously. I'm sorry, I said, but me and Thomas here, we have some issues we need to address between us. We can see that, but this is not the place for you to have a row. Why on earth would two people have a bloody fight in the middle of a woodgrove when you're supposed to be bloody quiet? It's ludicrously nonsensical. We both expressed our apologies to the hunters, who announced they were going further afield. Make sure you don't go to the right, they warned us, or we won't be responsible for our actions. If you sabotage another golden opportunity for us to strike it lucky. Word of advice, keep your trap shut. I'm sorry, mate, I said to Thomas. I've completely wrecked the hunt for the both of us by lashing out at you so inconsiderately. I really must apologise. This was not the right place for us to air our dirty laundry to all and sundry, even if the wild animals received the benefit of all of it. I guess I've been angry for a long while. I lost it by blowing up." "Forget about it," said Thomas. "I don't know about you, but I'd rather sit by the watering hole and enjoy our picnic together. Forget about the hunt. In truth, I'm just glad to be with you, bro, enjoying this beautiful day. It's never really about the hunt anyway. It's just good to be together. That's what it's all about, comradeship." So we did just that, gathering the picnic basket and our hunting gear, and finding a comfortable spot close to the watering hole to enjoy our picnic, rifles at the ready. If by any chance we might just strike it lucky, but that was exceedingly unlikely after our loud brawl. "You know what, bro? I'm so glad you let off steam. It's very good to get your feelings out, I find. By the way, you are absolutely right. I'm completely responsible for my abysmal behavior at the barbecue. I was using the alcohol as an excuse. The reality is I behaved atrociously, and I feel very, very ashamed of my actions. I am truly, truly sorry. If I could go back in time, I would change everything if I could. I beg you, Oliver, please don't let this ruin our friendship. You are my best friend. You're like my brother." My heart softened towards Oliver. We both embraced. "I forgive you. I feel the same. You're like a brother to me. Remember, I warned you not to get involved with Pamela. I had a sense that something like this would happen. But it's my sister you need to apologize to, not me." "There is no time like the present," he said. "I'm going to SMS her right now," he said, tapping into his phone and sending her a message. "What did you say?" I asked. "Never you mind," he said, his eyes twinkling. "I just want to sort this all out. If you must know, I told her I love her. I took ownership of what I did, although I doubt we can ever rekindle the flame after what I did. But I want her to know how truly sorry I am." In a trice, me and Thomas stopped eating, almost as if the food froze in our mouths. I don't know how to put it in words to you, but we both sensed that the forest had changed significantly. That was when we both realised that the pretty bird song had been vanquished, as if the birds themselves had withdrawn from their singing. The forest became bodeful, pretentious, menacing, as if the energy or congenial atmosphere had shifted substantially. I could feel prickles running down my spine, and glanced at Thomas, who looked at me with wide eyes that glinted with a pronounced look of trepidation. Even without words, we both knew something was terribly wrong. But what? All I can say is that the forest became very quiet. So hushed, in fact, that you could have heard a pin drop. The mute sound of silence took possession of the entire forest like an aggressive hijacker, commanding every tree, every blade of grass, every fern, every flower, every bird and animal, into an acquiescent, compliant submission. It was as if fear rose up into every living thing, enforcing its tight control, so even the trees seemed to freeze up in terror. That was when we heard the thunderous noise. It sounded like something very weighty, very substantial, very mighty, was moving through the forest, the kind of clamorous footfall you'd invariably expect to hear from a sizable elephant. Only this strident footfall was definitely bipedal, but with every pronounced step, the ground boomed, crashed, thundered, heaved, and vibrated, as if the earth beneath these feet was like a hollow drum. But whatever this thing was, his movements were cautiously slow and deliberate, almost as if every footstep was carefully considered and contemplated. Whatever was coming our way, I knew had to be a hell of a big. It seemed outer-worldly, as whatever it was appeared to be both mysteriously enigmatic to our reality. You would have thought that Thomas and I would quickly try to gather our senses together and get out of this place as fast as a jack hare. But sometimes in precarious situations like this, you act irrationally, vacillate and waver with an irresolute uncertainty,
as your mind tries to adjust to the changes in your environment with a great deal of difficulty. I think frozen would be the perfect word to describe our instincts, for we seemed to be superglued to our picnic spot, subdued by this incredible ominous presence looming ever closer towards us. Thomas grabbed his rifle, holding on to it for dear life, as if he was afraid to let go. I, on the other hand, remained fixed to the spot, like one of the moss-covered rocks in the earthen floor. For a while the footsteps suddenly stopped, but I could feel the remarkable presence of something weighty, something incredibly big. But how big, I couldn't be sure. Then me and Thomas felt eyes on us. You almost certainly know when someone is staring or leering at you, and these eyes seemed to sear through us like burning hot coals. Thomas was putting his fingers on his lips and bent his head down low with his rifle at the ready. Suddenly we could see a tenebrous shadowy movement running from tree to tree. Then with one mighty powerful bang, a tall ponderosa pine tree came crashing down to the ground, causing me to literally jump out of my skin. It landed with one hell of a mighty crash. Then we saw him. He was standing only yards away from us. I stared at the creature in an obsequious, abject horror, my eyes trying to assimilate the full gravity of what I was beholding, as if I couldn't quite grasp what I was in fact discerning. It was as if some monstrous creature from a fictional book had morphed into our subsistence. But this creature was not fictitious in any way. It was real, dauntingly so. I knew at once that this was in fact a Bigfoot. It was hard to grasp that such a critter that I'd never believed could exist here in North America was a factuality, like you or me. It stood up, lofty, exalted, dignified, majestic, puissant, on two thunderous tree-trunk-sized legs, at about 7 foot tall, possibly 600 pounds or even more. He was built like a piece of heavy farming machinery. He was burly, with potent muscular definition, shoulders so explosively strong they would invariably make an NFL player's shoulder pads look ridiculously silly, even pathetic. This idiosyncratic novel creature looked human, with remarkable ape-like influences. He had deep-set dark eyes, the colour of liquid treacle, that sparkled brightly, high cheekbones, a sloped, heavily furrowed forehead, a flat aquatic nose with 2 large open slits, a very pronounced square jawline. He was staring at us with an inquisitive curiosity, a measure of significant interest. In that moment he seemed remarkably non-threatening, but even so, I was petrified. It's like seeing a creature that is incredibly intimidating, that although it might appear benevolent or benign, you can never be quite sure if he might suddenly turn aggressive, like a threatening breed of dog, that you've been assured is friendly by the owner, but the reverse is found to be true. So you oscillate and waver with a tentative uncertainty about what you should do in the circumstances, as you quickly contemplate how to react. But I'm afraid the ever-impulsive, spontaneous Thomas didn't see it like that. He was shaking like a leaf. "Oh, my God," he whispered. "What the heck? This thing is going to bloody kill us." The next thing I knew, before I could restrain my best friend, Thomas had fired a shot at the creature, and it landed directly in his arm. This was not Thomas's finest thinking moment. The Bigfoot swatted the bullet like an angry mosquito bite. The problem with Thomas is that in his fear he acted impulsively before he took stock of the situation. Firing at the Bigfoot had not been a wise, sagacious move on his part. The next thing I knew was all hell broke loose, as the affronted Bigfoot was now exceedingly piqued and offended. He seemed maligned and provoked by the attack, feeling like he'd been unfairly wronged. He suddenly grabbed Thomas's rifle from him, bending it like a malleable toy, and with one hand he tossed it into the forest, where it landed with an almighty thump somewhere. The nettled Bigfoot then grabbed Thomas with his sizable hands, so that Thomas was looking directly into his eyes. The Bigfoot slapped Thomas once on the head, as if to say, "Get a grip! Don't you go shooting at me, young man!" I truly don't think he meant to hit Thomas hard, but Thomas literally stumbled on the floor in a crumpled heap. The Bigfoot bent over to examine my friend. I kid you not, he was genuinely upset. His fingers went into his mouth.
It was almost as if he was biting his nails apprehensively, as if he had come to the horrifying revelation of the gravity of what he'd done. He looked up at me with dark eyes filled with remorse and regret. I felt the words in my head. I didn't mean to, but he tried to hurt me. He said this pointing to his arm that was bleeding a little. It was clear he would live. The wound was like a graze on the knee to him. I don't know what possessed me, but I ran over to my friend. I tried desperately to wake Thomas up, not even considering my own safety. I felt for a pulse, but there was nothing. I was standing so close to the Bigfoot he could have reached out and touched me. When I looked up into his deep-set dark eyes, I realized they were incredibly kind, but very sad, very regretful. I realized then, without a shadow of a doubt, that this creature had just been curiously inquisitive about us. That was his only crime. Undeniably, if Thomas had not reacted in this inappropriate way, he would still be very much alive. It was a sobering thought. I was almost angry with him for always being so damn capriciously incautious and injudiciously impetuous. I looked at the Bigfoot and felt genuine compassion for him. He was visibly distressed. I said to him, "It's not your fault. It was an accident." Once again the words came into my head. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I didn't know he was so fragile." I knew that my friend Thomas was dead. I couldn't believe one hit from the Bigfoot's hand had done this to him. But then I imagined the creature was simply not aware of his own strength. I did get the impression that despite his huge size, he was young and inexperienced as a Bigfoot. Perhaps he wasn't aware of his own power. A little bit like a big dog, oblivious to his great size and the potential damage he could do. The creature grunted a few times, and then glided away and was gone. In a trice the birdsong returned to the woods, and then I began to sob and sob and sob over the loss of my very best friend. Before long I found myself at a police station being interviewed and interrogated by two officers that were literally accusing me of murdering my best friend. I was taken into a pedestrian, very beige-looking room that was small and poky with hard chairs and a small interview table. I could immediately sense both these men were champing at the bit to get a confession out of me. I was in no doubt that they really believed I was guilty of murdering my best friend. I was already emotionally distraught, but being interrogated by these two belligerent men made me feel like a teacup poodle being bullied by two very determined Rottweilers who were champing at the bit to get a confession out of me. I was a person with no history of violent crime, but they were jumping at straws, absolutely convinced, even before questioning me, that I was guilty as charged. I was asked if I needed my lawyer present. I said that that would not be necessary, but as the interview progressed, I began to seriously wonder if I had made the right choice in that regard. Could I be forced into a false confession, I wondered. Both the officers cross-examining me were big, sizable men, hardened professionals, very good at what they did. The kind of men exceedingly passionate about their jobs and fully determined to get results at any cost. Officer Markham spoke first. He rubbed his walrus moustache reflectively and said, "We interviewed the two British men that were hunting that day with you. They tell me, Oliver, that you ruined their hunt. One of the men, called Toby Willington, was a very helpful man. He said he was about to fire a shot at a very sizable deer, but the thing scampered away, as your two very loud voices were screaming at each other. You could be heard so loudly, scaring every animal within hearing distance. He said you were having an inflamed argument, and it got very well, let's just say, heated. One of the men said he heard you saying to your friend you wished you could kill him. I don't deny that, I said. I wished I could kill him. It's true, I said to the officers. Me and Thomas, we go back a long time. We're the very best of friends. He's like a brother to me. Well, what was this fight about? Said the officer, looking at me with a cynical raised brow. Why did you say you wished you could kill him? I did not mean it literally. It was what I said in the heat of the moment. I didn't actually mean it. You say things when you're angry at times, especially when you're comfortable with someone like I am with Thomas. How many stroppy teenagers, officers, have told their parents they wish they were dead or that they hate them? It's the same thing. They didn't mean a word of it. I suppose it's what you call dramatic free expression. Tell me something. Do you get angry often, Oliver? Asked the officer. Are you prone to violent outbursts? Absolutely not, officer, I insisted. Not at all. You can ask anyone who knows me. I'm very easygoing, actually, if you must know. So then why were you so angry with Thomas? I was angry with him, officer, because he was dating my sister. He cheated on her. I'm very protective over my younger sister. Naturally, I was infuriated with him for what he did. When I saw him again, it was after a month of no interaction with him. But I was still so pissed off with him. How he hurt my sister. It's hard to forgive. I put it to you, Oliver, that you were very aggrieved about Thomas's betrayal of your sister. You surreptitiously lured him into the woodgrove for some hunting, when you had in mind that you would hit him over the head with a rock or something, and blame it on a bear. How convenient, if you ask me. I think you were very, very angry about what he had done to your sister. You were determined to murder him in cold blood, to extract your ultimate revenge. What do you have to say about that, Oliver?
Oh my God, I thought. These two officers seriously believed I killed my very best friend. How am I ever going to explain what actually happened to Thomas? I knew I had to surreptitiously weave or incorporate some clever white lies or ingenious fabrications to my seemingly erroneous story to the officers. There was no way on God's earth I would be foolish or silly enough to spill the beans about what actually happened, and about our encounter with the anomalous Bigfoot. I mean, how could I? It would mean risking sounding like someone who was completely deranged or cooky or off their head. For if I was wearing their shoes, I would certainly come to a similar conclusion. The worst part of it all was I was a terrible liar. How on earth was I going to navigate my way through this without looking incredibly guilty in the process? I told you, I said. I was answering a call of nature behind a large tree, if you must know. I left Thomas alone for a while at the picnic spot by the lake. By this stage, me and Thomas had made up. We were friends again. If you don't believe me, Thomas SMS'd my sister to fully apologize for what he'd done to her, and to tell her he still loved her. I think that is proof enough that we had made up again by this stage. The officer wrote down my comments. We will check that out with the sister. But even if you did make up with Thomas, I put it to you, Oliver, that you were still very hot under the collar. The fight could have been rekindled all over again. You are wrong about that, officer. You're jumping to all kinds of ridiculous conclusions, if you don't mind my saying so. I can assure you our fight was over. All was forgiven and forgotten. We had reached a point where we realized how important our friendship was to each other. I am completely devastated to have lost my best friend. Frankly, officers, I'm offended you think so little of me, that I would be capable of harming my best friend. Why, the very idea is completely insane. Well, get back to your story, Oliver, will you? You say you were answering a call of nature. Thomas was left alone at your picnic spot by the lake. You were behind a tree relieving yourself. What happened next? Well, I remember hearing Thomas yell. He fired a shot. I saw this big black shadowy thing darting away, which I assumed had to be a black bear. I mean, what else could it be, officer? Then I discovered Thomas lying there dead. I watched the two officers surreptitiously make eye contact with each other, as brown eyes met blue briefly. I knew exactly what they were thinking. I was definitely telling porky pies as far as they were concerned. I could see that knowing look in their eyes, as if they hadn't believed a single word of my account. Of course they were right. I had lied, but I had tried to incorporate the truth within a lie,
And it wasn't going well, not at all. My heart sank like a rock plundering to the bottom of a large lake. I was digging myself into a big hole. My heart began to thunder in my chest. I could hear every discernible audible beat. My cheeks flushed brightly, as if I was guilty of this duplicitous crime. Even my fingers began to tremble, while my knee began to involuntarily shake. I could see gloomy, depressing pictures from a bleak, desolate future, tormenting and traumatizing me in my mind, rather like a bright, flashing, demoralizing black and white slideshow. I could glimpse at myself through a crack in this future, stuck in a miserable prison cell, in the confines of a tiny, uncomfortable bed, with an obnoxious cellmate who was beating me up all the time. This was a horrifying revelation to me. It dawned on me that I could be falsely accused of an insidious crime that I did not commit, unfairly locked away in a prison cell for life. You heard about it all the time, innocent people being charged with murder, a murder that they never committed. I could see how easily this could happen to me. The two officers looked as if they were fully satisfied that I was completely guilty of killing Thomas, but the only thing I was blameworthy of was being terrified of being falsely accused of my friend's abrupt, inadvertent death.
"So, Oliver," said the officer, staring at me judiciously through his very observant brown eyes,
"you really think we're going to buy your insane, ludicrous story that your best friend, who you so happen to have an altercation with in the heart of the wood grove, is hit on the head by a bear with one fatal blow? Then the bear simply glides away, and you find your friend conveniently dead. Things pan out very differently in a bear attack, I assure you, Oliver. If they feel threatened, they attack the face many times, not just once." I quickly intervened and piped, "Not everything is textbook, officer, I assure you. Life is full of surprises, as is the natural world. No two people act the same, and it's surely the case for bears too. If the person is no longer a threat because they are dead, surely the bear would just leave, wouldn't she? Maybe the bear hit Thomas one time. He dropped down dead. The bear was fully satisfied that Thomas was no longer a threat. Maybe a mother bear watching over her cubs. Who knows? It happens. It's not beyond the realms of impossibility. Why not one blow to the head, I ask you?"
The officers looked at each other in exasperation. Then there was an unexpected knock at the door. A female police officer stood in the doorway. She said, "Mrs. Hardings is here, Officer Markham. She's most insistent that she has to talk to you at once, this very minute."
"Very well," said the officer. "You're free to go now, Oliver, but we will be speaking to you again shortly." "You're not going to detain me?" I asked, looking surprised. "Not at the moment, Oliver, but I would watch my back if I were you. We haven't finished with you yet, not by a long shot."
Mrs. Hardings was not the kind of woman the officers were expecting to encounter by any manner of means, even though she was suffering the grievous loss of her son. She appeared to be the most level-headed, pragmatic and practical woman the officers had ever met. She was also incandescent. This elegant woman, wearing a navy blue tunic dress, golden sandals, and a leather necklace with a golden coiled sculptural pendant at the end, took her seat at the interview table opposite the officers. Officer Markham noticed the woman's makeup was immaculate. Her blonde hair was tied back in a neat ponytail with a leather bow. He had seen many bereaved parents before, but Mrs. Markham did not seem like any of them. She seemed remarkably in control of her emotions. But then again, people did grieve in different ways, didn't they? "We are very sorry for your loss, madam," said Officer Markham. "I would like to assure you we are doing everything in our power to investigate this crime." "What makes you think this is a crime?" demanded Mrs. Harding, looking directly at the officers with such a fierce look that they both grimaced. "You heard what Oliver told you, did you not? It was a bear that killed my son. So why are you not taking him at his word? That's what I want to know." "Well, the coroner's report does say that there was a blunt force injury to the head.
There were 2 witnesses who heard your son and his friend Oliver in a heated brawl together. It's a distinct possibility he may have lashed out at his friend, hit him on the head, even if it was accidental. We have to investigate every avenue, otherwise we would not be doing our jobs correctly. You call yourself police officers, scoffed Mrs. Harding. The 2 of you are an absolute joke. You should be ashamed of yourselves. Didn't even cross your mind for a single moment to examine the character of Oliver before you start jumping to all kinds of ridiculous conclusions. For your information, Oliver is like a second son to me. I love the bones off that boy, as if he was my very own. That boy is one of the kindest, most gentle souls I have ever met in my entire life. He isn't even capable of swatting a fly, let alone killing a person. He is incapable of hurting anyone. It is not in his blood. I've known him since he was 7. I remember one time, officers, when some boys were trying to pull the legs off a little frog. Oliver was absolutely mortified about that. He grabbed the frog from those unsuspecting boys, running away with it and popping it into the nearest pond. Eventually those boys caught up with him. They beat him up really badly until he was black and blue. But he didn't care about that. He had saved that frog. That was all that mattered in his book. Oliver, officers, is like a rare diamond. They don't make them like him anymore. Both the officers seemed genuinely moved by the story. So you really think he's incapable of physical violence, even in a heated argument? I absolutely knew without a shadow of a doubt that it would happen. But sometimes you need to hurt before you heal. I'll say this, though. It would never, and I repeat, never have turned physical. So you organised this hunt? Asked Officer Markham, looking rather surprised. Oh, of course I did. Someone had to do something. It was a train smash waiting to happen when Thomas got involved with Oliver's sister, because Oliver was naturally going to get very upset if Thomas hurt his sister. He's very protective over little Pamela. I remember he visited me, begged me to try and put a stop to the relationship. He was terrified of things going wrong between Thomas and his sister, so that they would end up hating each other. Oliver has always been astute like that. He could see the writing on the wall. He could see it wasn't a good idea. There was too much to lose. It was me that phoned Oliver up. I was the one that persuaded him that life was way too short and that he and Thomas needed to repair their differences and forgive each other. He agreed with me. He thought the hunt was a great idea. I organised the 2 of them to go on the hunt together. I anticipated that they would have a heated altercation, but I knew that that would potentially be a great thing. Well, I must say, when we interviewed Oliver, he became rather nervous. His body language looked distinctly guilty under cross-examination. Well, imagine what it must feel like to think you're being accused of murder when you didn't do a damn thing. It must be terrifying to contemplate being charged for something you didn't do and being incarcerated for the rest of your life. I would be trembling too. In case you may not have realised it, the poor man is grieving the loss of his very best friend. I am as well. People like you lot make insinuations that really are quite dreadful. Take a long, hard look at yourself, officers, in the mirror. How good would you feel about yourselves if you falsely accused someone of murder? Think about that long and hard, would you? I don't know how things work out in the police station, nor do I know the law, but I know Oliver is innocent. Do you hear me? If Oliver says my son's death is an accident, I 1,000% believe him, and so should you. No matter how bereft he may feel about his friend cheating on his sister, he would never, and I say never, never, never lay a hand on him. I would stake my life on it. This whole nightmare was an unfortunate accident, and that is that. And if you don't get that, officers, then you're stupider than you look. When Mrs. Hardings had left, the 2 officers looked at each other in bewilderment. What an extraordinary woman, said Officer Markham. I don't think I've ever met anyone like her. I would be scared to get on her wrong side. I'd certainly want her on my side, that's for sure. Officer Wilson looked at Officer Markham. I believe, Mrs. Harding, I don't think Oliver committed this crime. In fact, I don't think it was a crime at all. When she told us the story about the frog, I knew that Oliver was incapable of harming his friend. He is clearly not the violent type. He hasn't got it in him.
Back to Oliver. I'm very glad to inform you that I was never interrogated again by those officers. Even the coroner admitted that the manner of how Thomas died could never ever be fully determined. But it wasn't impossible that he could have been throttled by a bear with just one blow to the head. Granted, the case was considered unusual, but then again, not everything in life is written in stone. The funeral for my friend Oliver was naturally devastating. No one was more sad than me, Pamela, and both the Hardings. My sister Pamela had received a text that read,
I'm sitting here with your brother in the wood grove. He had it out with me, how much I'd hurt you, Pammy. We made such a commotion together, disturbed all the wildlife, annoyed 2 British hunters who told us to shut the F up. They weren't best pleased with us having such a brawl. Needless to say, we are sitting here by the water's edge, having made up, enjoying our picnic together. We don't really have the stomach for hunting now. You know your brother anyway. He hates killing anything, even when I assure him that culling is an important part of managing the deer population. Not a day goes by, Pammy, that I don't think of you. I love you with all my heart. I know I messed up. What I did was reprehensible. I'm truly, truly ashamed. Please have it in your heart to forgive me.
My sister was gutted after receiving the text. She said she completely forgave Thomas. It was a year later, on the anniversary of his death, that me and Mrs. Harding decided to go and visit the area by the watering hole where Thomas met his fortuitous end. We decided we would take a picnic with some champagne to celebrate his life, which is exactly what we did. We had notified the lodge of our intentions, and they ensured us that no one else was hunting that day, out of respect for Thomas. When we arrived at the quaint little lodge, the retired owners welcomed us warmly, expressing their commiserations. Both me and Mrs. Harding sprayed ourselves down with the spray hunters use to not be detected by animals. But we did this not for the purposes of hunting, but in the fleeting hope we might spot some wildlife. I had told Mrs. Harding the true story about what had happened to her son, and about the Bigfoot, as Mrs. Harding had such an open mind, which is a prerequisite for any aspiring artist, that I knew I could tell her anything, and she would believe me. I believe you, Oliver, she had said. I know you would never make something up like that. I appreciate why you never told the police about this. By all accounts, it was the most beautiful day, the kind of day that Thomas would have loved. Over the year, Mrs. Harding and I had grown even closer, as Thomas's death had cemented our friendship even further, and she was absolutely my second mother without a doubt. As we entered the wood grove, it was hauntingly surreal. Suffice to say, going back to the very same place brought the memories flooding back. Wow, this is quite beautiful, gasped Mrs. Harding, as we ambled through the viridescent countryside together. I think I'd become a hunter myself to hang around in a place like this all day. Look at that gorgeous fungi. It's an artist's dream. As well as those green mosses and ferns. Oh, my word, it truly is nirvana. She turned around to me and smiled. I'm glad about one thing. If you're going to choose a place where you would breathe your last, this would be a pretty good place to go. Most people are not that lucky. It was so typical of Mrs. Harding to see the positive side in everything. She had a great resilience, greater than a beach ball in her optimistic attitude towards life that was always expressed in the beautiful colours she incorporated in her art. Before long we were sitting by the lake, and close to the time when Thomas had breathed his last. We both threw flowers into the water and said some words. "Hello, darling," said Mrs. Harding. "I miss you so terribly, sweetheart, but one day I'll see you again. I'm here today with Oliver, celebrating the life you shared with us. You were so beautiful, sweetheart. It was an honour and a privilege to be your mother. We miss you so much."
"Hello, Thomas," I said. "It's me. We miss you, bro. A light has gone out in our lives since you've been gone. You will always be my best friend. The police nearly nailed me for murdering you. I think you will find that very funny. You always did have a sordid sense of humour. But I do miss you, bro," I said, a couple of tears welling up in my eyes. "Now don't you dare start," said Mrs. Harding, pulling out a tissue from her pocket. "Or you'll get me blubbing too," she said, dabbing my eyes with the tissues.
As me and Mrs. Harding were eating our sandwiches, admiring the transfixing views over the silvery water that gleamed in the soft light, very suddenly the forest became inauspiciously quiet, as the bird song seemed to just drift away, melting into the ether like the smoke from a chimney. Then a wind began to whistle between the trees. That was when we heard the booming sound, the sound of heavy feet, that I'd heard a year before. I looked at Mrs. Harding in astonishment. "It sounds exactly like him." "Like who?" asked Mrs. Harding, looking perturbed. "Like the Bigfoot that killed your son by mistake." Mrs. Harding tensed, and then bursting through the trees, we saw the Bigfoot. I recognized him at once, although he seemed more mature. Mrs. Harding looked astonished. Her eyes grew as round as saucers. Her mouth dropped wide open. This was not what she was expecting to see. Neither was I. One thing we had not been anticipating was that this Bigfoot had been expecting us. He had known we were coming, and furthermore, he knew exactly who Mrs. Harding was. Now I ask you, how can such an anomalous creature know such things? Do they have a psychic intuition? I'm not sure, but it seemed like they do. The creature stood up proud and tall, his eyes looking directly at Mrs. Harding, and she looked into his. I watched in amazement as a tear spilled down Mrs. Harding's face. She nodded. That was when I realized that the Bigfoot was speaking to her telepathically. Mrs. Harding nodded again. The Bigfoot ran over to her and put a stone in her hands. It was an amethyst. He looked at me and nodded, and then he glided away. "He spoke to you," I said. "What did he say?" "Oh, what a beautiful creature!" gasped Mrs. Harding. "What a wonderful soul! Those eyes! I've got to paint those eyes! They're so kind!" "But what did he say to you, Mrs. Harding?" "He told me that he was expecting me, that I was not to worry about my son. He's very happy, and I'll see him again, and that he's in a very beautiful place. He said he was sorry for what had happened, but he was oblivious to his own strength. He said the stone is to help me connect with my son. So if I hold it and close my eyes, I will see him." "Oh, my goodness," I gasped. "He said all that to you?" "Yes, he did. You can see he knows things, Oliver, things that humans can't comprehend. Oh, I feel so happy. This calls for a celebration. We must open the champagne." And we did, to celebrate Thomas's life. So every year we went back to the hunting lodge to remember Thomas. But I regret to say we never saw the Bigfoot again. There you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Candy, and I live 25 minutes away from the city of Whitehorse in a spacious custom-designed home on 16 acres of land. Many of the custom-built houses in our part of the world look incredibly alike, with of course the exception of houses that are made from wooden logs. Where I live is so picturesque and stunningly beautiful, and my house has close access to wilderness trails, lakes, mountains and forests. Every time I wake up in the morning, I am literally surrounded by the most exquisite views of magnificent towering mountains reaching into the skies like vast massive pyramids that are particularly spectacular during the winter season when they are carpeted in thick layers of glistening white snow. Where I live is in the Yukon in northern Canada, well known for the stunning visual displays of the northern lights, known as the aurora borealis, that are usually seen whirling in blankets of exquisite greens that literally envelop the Yukon in an ethereal sense of mysterious intrigue. These lights are best seen in the countryside, unobstructed by the city lights of Whitehorse, because obviously the city lights can be distracting. Believe it or not, these glorious lights can sometimes change into rarer colours like pinks and reds and crimsons. I believe that the Yukon is in fact the most ideal place in the entire world for Bigfoots to live, as there is just so much never-ending wilderness here, water sources of so many kinds, and a teeming abundance of wildlife. Before I get to the pinnacle of my story about my extraordinary Bigfoot encounter, let me first explain my family setup to you. I'm the oldest daughter, with a younger sibling called Chloe, and I live in this very large house with both of my parents, whom work in the city of Whitehorse. My father works as a manager for a very well-known North American food chain, and my mother owns a souvenir shop selling trinkets and paintings to tourists who visit our part of the world.
We get tons of tourists who come to Whitehorse because they love to go sleigh riding and are fascinated by the Northern Lights. And there's so much to do here, the list goes on. There's all kinds of things to do for outdoor enthusiasts and people who like action-packed holidays. Even in 2018, I actually saw the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge in Horsetail, and they spent 24 hours in the city on their royal tour of Canada, and I actually got to speak to Kate. That was 2 months after my Bigfoot encounter had occurred, to be exact. My story begins when one day my sister and I were on a summer break, and although there are tons of interesting things to do in the city of Whitehorse, we decided to go exploring one of the hiking trails that are literally yards away from our home. I mean, why not? We thought it would be great to go camping along the trail for a couple of days or so. My parents were nonchalant about us going, as long as we didn't camp too far away from the house, and took a rifle with us for protection, just in case we had an encounter with a bobcat or a bear. This all happened 2 years ago, to be precise, in 2018, when I was 17 years old and Candy was only 15. I'm ashamed to say that even though I've lived in this house for 17 long years, not once did I ever explore the trail close to our home. In truth, there are not many people that I've ever seen using that hiking trail before, as it isn't clearly marked. It's pretty old, rugged, and slightly overgrown. My dad reckons it's not been used since the turn of the century, and he's probably right. He said he couldn't find it anywhere when he was looking at a tourist map more recently. So it's an exceedingly old trail, leading to an area that I doubt has been frequented by hikers in recent years. Chloe and I are always prepared for the outdoors, as you can invariably imagine. I'm always kitted out with walking shoes, anoraks, camping equipment, you name it, because we have a very active outdoor life that involves swimming, canoeing, bicycling, horse riding, and even fishing. Believe me, Chloe and I have done it all. My sister and I got our backpacks prepared with everything we would need for our camping trip, such as flashlights, fire starters, sleeping bags, tents, and all the usual necessities. We then left on our merry way for our little adventure. We were very excited because it was just 2 of us camping under the stars, and the weather was seemingly perfect. We couldn't have wished for anything better. The first part of our hike was pretty strenuous and very exhausting because it was all uphill, and the trail ran through a vast wooded area filled with a selection of mixed trees, from spruces, firs, pines, cedars, and maple birch trees, and it was all enchantingly beautiful. We ran across a startled red fox that scurried away hurriedly, looking less than pleased to see us. And of course we encountered several snowshoe hares along our way, darting around the place looking surprised to encounter humans, almost as if they were saying, "What on earth are you doing here? You don't fit in around here." It was such a beautiful day, and my sister and I walked for hours, rarely enjoying the soft beams of sunlight on our faces. We listened to the beautiful bird song in the valley and watched the occasional moose that crossed our path and quickly tottered away. We finally reached a clearing, and it was the oddest thing that I've ever seen in my entire life. On the left-hand side of this wide open space was a very large area that looked exactly like an ancient Indian burial ground, only that did not make any sense at all, because this was not an old burial ground by any means, but was exceedingly fresh. And although I'm no expert on these matters, I would say that none of these burial plots were more than 5 years old. There were about 8 mounds of freshly dug earth in the shape of very large, long graves, at approximately 8 to 10 feet in length and equally as wide. So these things were pretty massive. On the sides of each mounds were layers of big stones, and the individual graves were marked with strange sticks poking out of the ground, looking like weird kinds of menacing symbols, almost as if every stick represented the individual that had died in some kind of mystery code. "What in God's name is all this?" said Chloe, looking at me in horror. "This looks like the grave site of giants." We immediately got out of the area as fast as we could. The whole place had an ominous, airy feeling about it that left the hair on our necks standing on edge. A while of extra strenuous and exhilarating walking uphill led us to another open clearing, where we stumbled quite by chance upon another extraordinary sight that was so well camouflaged by the underlying brush that we almost failed to see it. I only happened to notice it because a very large black raven was perched on a branch close to the structure, and it was making that cawing sound that they usually make, which immediately got my attention. I studied the bird closely, and my eyes wandered towards the stacked basket-like formation standing beneath it. It looked like a massive igloo-type structure that was as big as a small hut, made with branches, twigs, and intertwined with vine leaves. We knew at once that something highly intelligent had actually made this hut, but who or what we could not imagine. We walked inside the igloo-like structure, made of leaves and branches, and we saw some deer skins carpeting one area of the floor that covered a huge pile of grasses, making what appeared to be a makeshift bed that did look exceedingly comfortable and absolutely enormous. Whoever was lying here had to be huge. We saw a pile of what looked like sharpened stones and pieces of wood that reminded me of the instruments that Stone Age men used in prehistoric times. It was all utterly bizarre. I picked up some of those sharpened stones, and it was so sharp, I kid you not, I nearly sliced my finger off, much to my horror. None of my mother's kitchen knives at home were ever this sharp. Chloe and I were utterly bewildered and intrigued at the same time. We couldn't make sense of any of this. It was all so outer-worldly. It was almost like we had been teleported back to another time, like the Stone Ages. As we were leaving this igloo-like structure of branches and leaves, we noticed a fire pit outside the opening, and it had been used very recently, because we could tell that the ash was still warm to the touch. "It must be some wacko human living here," I said to my sister. "Someone who takes living off the grid to an extreme, and lives as close to nature as you can imagine." "Either that," said Chloe, "or maybe he's a psycho that escaped from the loony bin." She suddenly looked at me in alarm. "What about all those graves we saw? Maybe the psycho is going around killing people and burying them there. We could be next," she said, with a look of horror growing on her face. "Chloe," I scolded, "stop being so melodramatic. You watch too many of those ghastly horror movies. For a start, we don't know if those are actually graves in the first place. And for all we know, it's just a harmless vagrant who lives in here." "Harmless," said Chloe. "Really? You think it's harmless when it sharpened those stones to a fine point that nearly sliced your finger off? And you reckon he's harmless?" I was just about to scold Chloe again for overreacting when we heard the sound of very heavy feet coming towards us. Bear in mind, we were carrying backpacks at the time that had an awful propensity to rattle when we moved. I gestured to Chloe to be as quiet as possible, and we made it in time to hide behind the trunk of a very large cedar tree, where we hid, hardly daring to breathe. Whatever was coming towards us sounded as hefty as a large elephant, without exaggeration, only it was someone who was bipedal, because they were definitely walking on 2 feet. I decided that it had to be the vagrant or the vagabond in the woods, who must be a seriously overweight individual to sound that massive, which was somewhat incongruous, I thought, for a man of the woods, who I thought should always be svelte and very fit. I appeared around the corner of the tree and was not prepared for what I was actually witnessing. It was a humanoid creature of about 10 to 11 feet tall that looked like a wild man, covered in long reddish-brown hair from head to toe. He had an elongated scowl and a pinky-brown hairless face that appeared rugged, weathered, incredibly leathered, and extremely wrinkled. I'd heard of Bigfoots before, but this creature was more human than ape-like in his appearance. He was monstrously huge. I would say he was about 1,000 pounds and 6 feet in width, and he had the longest arms that I've ever seen in my life that fell well below his knees and could easily touch his toes. I can honestly say that this hairy humanoid is the scariest, most powerful, formidable creature that I've ever seen, equally on par with encountering a tiger or a lion. All I wanted to do in that moment was to hightail it as fast as I could out of the woods. I was utterly terrified. Just looking at this creature, while he was oblivious to our presence, literally sent waves of dread down my spine, and terror coursing through every vein in my body like a relentless steam train powered on full throttle, because the more that I observed this creature, the more terrified I became. Chloe and I had been walking all day. By now we were utterly exhausted, tired, and ravenous. And so when the humanoid creature ventured inside the igloo grass-like structure where he clearly lived, I pushed Chloe forward. "Let's get out of here," I whispered. "Now!" "I don't think I could move another muscle," Chloe moaned. "My legs are aching and everything hurts. I'm so tired and so hungry." "We need to camp as far away from him as possible," I said to Chloe. "Just try and walk a little bit further. Tomorrow we'll turn around and go back home. I promise." "This place has weirded me out," said Chloe. "I've never been so freaked out by something before. We should never have taken this trail. No one uses it anymore for good reason, it seems." Finally, Chloe and I found a little clearing close to a pretty creek, and it was far away enough from the giant humanoid for us to camp, making us feel a whole lot safer. We prepared a large fire pit, boiled some hot water to make a brew of sweet tea, and then we cooked some marinated chicken kebabs that I'd brought over the open grill, and we sat back and spoke about what we'd seen. "He wasn't human," said Chloe, looking at me intently, chewing a piece of chicken hungrily. "But he wasn't an ape either, was he?" "So is he a Bigfoot or not?" she asked. "He must be some kind of a Bigfoot," I said. "I imagine you get all types. Some may have more human-like characteristics, while others may look like apes more, I imagine." "Well, he did have very long arms and an exceedingly prominent brow ridge, so typical of a Bigfoot, I suppose," reflected Chloe, who knew just about everything there was to know about Bigfoot as a subject, because she had always been intrigued and fascinated by it for many years. However, I think our encounter with the hairy humanoid had shaken her to the core, because even though she tried to hide it, I could see she was well and truly rattled. "Whatever he was," I said, "he gave me the chills. He was one of the scariest creatures, whether he was a Bigfoot or not." That night we went to bed early. Our muscles were aching from our strenuous walking, and we couldn't wait to get some sleep. It was not long before we were fast asleep, leaving the strange experience of our peculiar day long behind us, as we entered into a blissful dreamlike state. Suddenly at about 2 a.m. in the morning, we were awoken to something very big and heavy thumping our tent. We could actually watch the imprint of a hefty hand hitting our tent many times over, and whatever or whoever it was, they were making no secret of their presence. "It's him," whispered Chloe in horror. "I think he's going to kill us." I immediately grabbed my rifle, wondering whether to confront the creature or just stay in our tent and not react to the slapping sounds. While I was contemplating the next course of action, Chloe and I quickly placed our light helmets on for visibility and slipped into our walking shoes. By this time a short while had passed, and the slapping sounds on our tent had all but receded. I peered out of the tent very briefly, but saw nothing there, so I beckoned to Chloe that the coast was clear, and we ran for cover to some nearby trees, with our rifles at the ready. Soon we saw him again, the monstrous humanoid we had encountered yesterday. He was stomping around our camping spot like a grumpy old man, looking less than pleased. He began to growl, roar, and howl simultaneously, and then he started to shake our tents violently, creating the effect of a hazardous windstorm. He was trying to scare us out of our tents, like a fox prizing a rabbit out of its hole. Believe me, I was so relieved we were not in there. Suddenly the creature just tore our entire tent apart, and he shredded the tough canvas as if it was just tissue paper with his monstrous hands and dexterous sausage-like fingers. He then pulled our sleeping bags apart, and they dotted the clearing like pieces of firecrackers found after a July the 4th celebration. In his hands we literally watched this man bend the metal back of our packs like a piece of plasticine. We watched him just throw everything around the clearing like a rampaging rhino in an incandescent rage. Food parcels hung perilously on tree branches, and the rest of our clothes were strewn all over the place like a child's messy bedroom. Chloe and I were frozen to the spot in absolute fear. We simply could not move our bodies. We were immobilized by the escalating terror that we were feeling. Forget what they say about adrenaline giving you the ability to run away as fast as you can. Chloe and I were paralysed by fear. We shook like jellies, and we just stood there like sitting ducks, almost waiting to be devoured by this enraged predator. Suddenly we heard him coming towards us. He must have sensed us or smelt us, and his flat nostrils flared up, and his mouth curled back like a large cat to reveal a huge set of white human-like teeth. He growled at us, and that sound was so terrifying it was beyond anything I can ever start to describe, but it caused the ground to vibrate and to shake, and our eardrums to almost burst. If looks could kill, and if I ever saw hatred and evil, it was in those big brown eyes that held not an ounce of humanity in them. It was like they were devoid of any compassion. I truly sensed that this creature wanted to kill us. There was no doubt in my mind about that. "Shoot him," begged Chloe. "Shoot him, Candy, please." I want to tell you, against this monstrous beast, I truly felt like a silly little toddler, bringing out a kid's water pistol that I was pointing at the creature. My hands were shaking so very much, and how I managed to aim that rifle I will never know. But the booming sound of the pistol got the creature even madder. He started lunging towards me, reaching out with a monstrous hairy hand to grab me, while he roared at me at the same time. I pointed the rifle at his jaw and blew off a corner of his face. I could hardly believe I'd done it. The creature looked totally startled as some of his teeth and a piece of jaw went flying into the air like pieces of shrapnel. I think he was in desperate pain because he let out a shrill, agonizing scream, and clutching his jaw that was oozing with blood, he ran away from us as fast as he could. Chloe and I were startled out of our frozen comatose state, and suddenly we were energized with a seemingly superhuman energy that enabled us to run through that wooded clearing as fast as we possibly could. When we got home, we were so knocked out and so utterly exhausted that we slept for 24 hours straight. Once we'd recovered, the first words out of my father's mouth was, "What the hell happened to you both? What on earth did you see?" We told our horrified parents our startling story, and my father is convinced we encountered a wild man or a Bigfoot of some kind. I truly do not know what we actually saw. Is there a difference between a Bigfoot and a wild man? I do not know the answer to that question, but whatever we saw, it did behave like a rabid dog. I would expect something that looked more human to be less violent, but this thing was exceedingly dangerous. I do believe if it had not blown off the corner of his jaw, that Chloe and I would be dead by now. I am in no doubt in my mind about that. My experience has put me off hiking, because I believe the more common hikers' trails are invariably safer. So it hasn't put me off hiking, because I think they're much safer if you go on the normal hiking routes. I think these things, whatever they are exceedingly territorial and stay away from humans. I'm convinced there are others like him living in the Yukon because of the burial ground that we saw. So if you are the type of person who prefers an action-filled holiday rather than sunning yourself on a tropical beach, why not consider popping up to Horsetail? Who knows, you might end up buying a trinket from my mother's shop.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.